At 10:27 hours on June 4th, 1942, Lieutenant Commander C. Wade McClusky banked his SBD Dauntless dive bomber into a hard turn over an empty stretch of the Pacific Ocean. His fuel gauges were deep into the red. His 33 aircraft had been airborne for over 2 hours, searching for a Japanese carrier force that was supposed to be right beneath them, and was not. Nothing below but ocean. Nothing ahead but more ocean. The 4 Japanese fleet carriers his intelligence officers had promised him were gone. Disappeared. McClusky had a decision to make, and he had about 4 minutes of search time left before he would have to abort and fly his planes back to the USS Enterprise. If he could even make it back at all, he pressed on. That single decision, to keep searching, to keep faith with a mission that looked like a failure, would trigger the most consequential naval engagement in the history of the Pacific. Within 6 minutes of finding his targets, 3 Japanese fleet carriers would be mortally damaged. By sunset, a 4th would join them. The entire strategic balance of the Pacific War would tilt permanently toward the United States. But to understand why any of that matters, and to understand why McClusky's dive bombers were even out there in the first place, you need to go back, 6 months back, to a Sunday morning in Hawaii that ended the world as America knew it. December 7th, 1941. 07:55 hours, Pearl Harbor Naval Station, Oahu, Hawaii. The first wave of Japanese carrier aircraft, 183 planes in total, launched from 6 carriers of the Kido-Butai, as Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's elite First Air Fleet, appeared over the mountains of Oahu without warning. Torpedo bombers came in low over the harbor. High-level bombers came in straight and precise. 0 fighters swept ahead to clear the skies. The first torpedo struck the battleship USS Oklahoma at 07:57 hours. By 08:02, the battleship USS Arizona had absorbed a converted 16-inch armor-piercing shell repurposed as an aerial bomb, which penetrated her forward deck and detonated the forward ammunition magazine. The explosion was so violent it threw men hundreds of feet into the air. The Arizona sank in 9 minutes. She took 1,177 of her crew with her. She still lies at the bottom of Pearl Harbor today. By the time the second wave of Japanese aircraft had completed their runs and Nagumo had ordered his carriers to withdraw, the damage to the United States Pacific Fleet was staggering. 8 battleships had been hit. The USS Arizona and USS Oklahoma were total losses. The USS California and USS West Virginia had been sunk at their moorings. The USS Nevada, attempting to sortie under fire, had been bombed and beached to prevent her from sinking in the main channel and blocking all harbor traffic. 3 cruisers were damaged. 3 destroyers were sunk. A dry dock was destroyed. In total, 2,403 Americans were killed that morning. Another 1,178 were wounded. At Hickam Field and the other Army Air Corps airfields on Oahu, 188 aircraft were destroyed on the ground, most of them parked wingtip to wingtip, most of them never getting off the ground. The Japanese attack had been designed by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, as commander of the Imperial Japanese Navy's combined fleet, a man who had studied at Harvard, worked as a naval attaché in Washington, D.C., and understood American industrial capacity better than almost any other senior officer in Japan. Yamamoto did not want war with the United States. He had argued against it. He knew that Japan's oil reserves would last perhaps 2 years of active warfare. He knew that American factories would eventually produce more ships, more planes, more tanks, and more ammunition than Japan could ever match. He reportedly told Prime Minister Tojo before the attack that he could give Japan 6 months, maybe a year, of victory. And after that, he could guarantee nothing. He was right about almost all of it. But in December 1941, those projections seemed impossibly remote. In the first hours after Pearl Harbor, what was immediate was the damage, and the shock, and the rage. President Franklin Roosevelt addressed Congress at 12:33 hours on December 8, 1941. He called December 7th a date which will live in infamy. Congress declared war on Japan within hours. Germany and Italy declared war on the United States on December 11th, and the United States immediately returned the declaration. In 1 week, a country that had been officially neutral was now at war with 3 of the most powerful military nations on Earth simultaneously. The question, which nobody in Washington had a clean answer to, was what to do about it. How does a nation that had allowed its military to shrink to a fraction of its pre-World War I strength, a nation whose army in 1939 had ranked somewhere behind Portugal's in total size, it's a nation that had not fought a major land war since 1918. How does that nation fight on 2 hemispheres against enemies who had been at war for years? The answer, in late 1941 and early 1942, was badly. The strategic framework that emerged from the Arcadia Conference, the December 1941 meetings in Washington between Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, established the principle that would govern the entire Allied war effort. Germany first. The reasoning was direct. Germany was the primary threat. Germany's U-boats were strangling British supply lines in the Atlantic. Germany had overrun France, Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Yugoslavia. Germany had driven deep into the Soviet Union and was potentially capable of knocking the USSR out of the war entirely. If Germany defeated Britain, if Germany defeated the Soviets, if Germany consolidated its hold on continental Europe, no combination of American and Allied strength could dislodge it. Japan, for all its Pacific victories, could not threaten London or Moscow. Germany could. So Germany would be addressed first with maximum effort. Japan would be contained, held at bay, fighting would continue, but the primary resources would flow toward Europe. This was the grand strategy. In practice, executing it required surviving the first year of the Pacific War, which was a crisis in itself. In Washington, Admiral Chester Nimitz was appointed Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet on December 31, 1941. 24 days after Pearl Harbor. He arrived at Pearl Harbor by submarine to survey the damage. What he found was devastating. But he also found something the Japanese attack had not destroyed. 3 aircraft carriers, the USS Enterprise, USS Lexington, and USS Saratoga, had not been in harbor on December 7th. The Enterprise had been delivering aircraft to Wake Island. The Lexington was on a similar mission to Midway. The Saratoga was on the west coast. They were intact. Their air groups were intact. And in Nimitz's assessment, they were the only offensive weapons he had. He would use them. Through early 1942, Nimitz authorized a series of carrier raids against Japanese-held islands in the Pacific. The Marshall Islands, Wake Island, Marcus Island. Strikes more calculated to build American morale and develop operational skill than to deliver decisive strategic damage. They were learning raids as much as anything else. The carrier crews were learning how to coordinate strikes, how to recover damaged aircraft, how to refuel at sea under operational conditions. Every operation refined the system. Then in April 1942 came something far more audacious. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle led 16 B-25 Mitchell medium bombers off the deck of the USS Hornet, a maneuver that had never been tried before, that most naval aviators believed was aerodynamically marginal, and flew them directly at Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, and Osaka. The Hornet launched the B-25s from 700 miles offshore, further than planned, because a Japanese patrol vessel had spotted the fleet, which meant the aircraft did not have enough fuel for their planned recovery airfields in China. Doolittle briefed his crews and gave them the choice. Every man flew. The bombs dropped on April 18, 1942, caused relatively minor physical damage, but the psychological impact was enormous in both directions. America needed a victory, however symbolic, and the headlines delivered one. Japan's military leadership, humiliated by the breach of the home island's invulnerability, accelerated a decision already being debated. a decision that led directly to the Midway operation. Japan's strategic situation in early 1942 was one of simultaneous strength and vulnerability. The empire was expanding rapidly. Resources were flowing in from the newly conquered territories. But the naval leadership understood that the American carriers had not been destroyed at Pearl Harbor, and that those carriers would eventually be used to strike back. Admiral Yamamoto's answer was Midway. Midway Atoll, a pair of small islands roughly 1,000 miles northwest of Pearl Harbor, was a critical American base. If Japan could seize Midway, it could extend its defensive perimeter and potentially threaten Pearl Harbor itself. More importantly, in Yamamoto's calculus, an attack on Midway would force the American carriers to respond. They would come out to defend Midway. And when they came out, Japan's superior naval forces would destroy them. Yamamoto's plan was operationally ambitious to the point of recklessness. His order of battle for the Midway operation included virtually the entire Japanese combined fleet, 4 fleet carriers of the Kido Butai under Vice Admiral Nagumo, a bombardment group, an invasion convoy, a massive battleship force under Yamamoto himself, positioned 300 miles behind Nagumo, an Aleutian Islands diversionary force, and a submarine picket line positioned to detect American carrier movements. The plan depended on surprise, on the Americans not knowing that Midway was the target. The plan had one catastrophic flaw. The Americans knew everything. Commander Joseph Rochefort led Station Hypo, the Navy's signals intelligence unit based at Pearl Harbor, housed in a windowless basement room beneath the 14th Naval District headquarters that his team called the Dungeon. By May 1942, Station Hypo had achieved sufficient penetration of the Japanese naval code JN-25 to read a significant portion of Japanese encrypted traffic. As the intercepts were fragmentary and required enormous interpretive skill, but they revealed an imminent Japanese offensive at a target the Japanese referred to as AF. Rochefort's team believed AF was Midway. To confirm it, they arranged for the Midway garrison to transmit an unencrypted message reporting that the atoll's fresh water distillation plant had broken down. Within days, a Japanese transmission reported that AF was short of fresh water. The confirmation removed all doubt. Nimitz now knew the target, the approximate date, and the Japanese order of battle. Nimitz's response was to set a trap. He ordered all 3 available American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the badly damaged Yorktown, which had been hit at the Battle of the Coral Sea in early May, and was estimated by repair crews to need 90 days of dry dock work, to take up position northeast of Midway and wait in ambush. The Yorktown's crew worked 72 hours straight in dry dock. They got her operational in 3 days. On May 28th, Enterprise and Hornet departed Pearl Harbor. On May 30th, Yorktown followed. They took up station at Point Luck, northeast of Midway, beyond the range of Japanese search patterns, and they waited. On June 4th, 1942, at approximately 0430 hours, Admiral Nagumo launched his first strike against Midway, 108 aircraft in 2 waves. Simultaneously, he launched a search mission, 7 aircraft on fan-shaped patterns looking for American ships. One of those search planes, a Tone float plane assigned to Sector 6, was delayed in launching by a catapult malfunction. It would not find the American carriers until 0728. By then, Nagumo's first strike was already over Midway, and his Kido Butai's flight decks were in the process of being reorganized for a second strike against the island's installations. The Midway garrison fought back. Marine fighters scrambled from Henderson Field, Brewster Buffaloes and Grumman Wildcats, aircraft outclassed in nearly every performance category by the Japanese Mitsubishi Zero. Of the 25 Marine Buffaloes that engaged the Japanese strike force that morning, 13 were shot down. 3 others were so badly damaged they never flew again. 6 torpedo bombers from Midway attacked the Japanese carriers and were wiped out. 4 Army Air Force B-26 Marauders attempted torpedo runs and were cut to pieces. Then 15 B-17 Flying Fortresses dropped their bombs from high altitude and hit nothing. High-altitude horizontal bombing against maneuvering ships was almost never effective. Of 6 brand-new TBF Avenger torpedo bombers on their very first combat mission, 5 were shot down, and the 6th returned with 1 surviving crewman, the aircraft so badly damaged it would never fly again. None of them scored a hit on a Japanese ship, but they kept the Japanese carrier's combat air patrol occupied. They kept Nagumo's attention focused downward. Nagumo agreed with his strike leader's request for a second strike on Midway. He ordered his aircraft, which had been armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes designed for attacking ships, to be rearmed with conventional bombs for a second land strike. And Japanese deck crews began pulling torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs off the aircraft parked on the hangar decks. Torpedoes were left stacked on the hangar decks. Fuel lines were left exposed. Aviation gasoline was being transferred through open hose connections across the hangar decks of 4 ships loaded with armed aircraft. Nagumo's carriers had become, in effect, enormous floating bombs. Then the delayed tone float plane reported American ships to the northeast, and then corrected itself to report what appeared to be a carrier with the surface force. Nagumo faced an impossible decision. He chose to wait, finish rearming, recover his returning first strike aircraft, and then launch a fully organized, properly armed attack against the American fleet. He did not have the time to wait. Aboard the USS Enterprise, Air Group Commander Lieutenant Commander C. Wade McClusky led his dive bombers away from the carrier at approximately 08:06 hours. Yorktown's air group launched at 09:05. By the time the American aircraft converged on the estimated position of the Japanese carriers, those carriers had moved. McClusky arrived over an empty ocean. His fuel was critical. Every minute of additional search time meant fewer gallons of fuel for the return trip, and some return trips were already looking mathematically marginal. He circled once, twice, scanning the ocean below. He pressed on southwest, along what he calculated might be the course a fleet would take toward Midway. The destroyer Arashi saved him. Arashi had been left behind by Nagumo's fleet, depth-charging the American submarine USS Nautilus. Yet when Arashi finally abandoned the attack and increased to full speed to rejoin the carriers, she left a white foaming wake stretching across the ocean like a road sign. McClusky saw it from altitude. He followed it. At approximately 10:20 hours, through broken cloud cover, he spotted the Japanese carriers below. 4 massive ships, their flight decks brown with packed aircraft, their wakes curving in defensive maneuvers, a screen of destroyers and cruisers ringing them, and not a single Japanese fighter at altitude to oppose him. The Zero Combat Air Patrol had been pulled down to sea level by the torpedo bomber attacks that were being slaughtered at that moment below. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron had led Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet to the Japanese carriers. He had attacked without fighter escort, his 15 ancient TBD Devastator torpedo bombers grinding in at low speed and low altitude directly into a wall of Zero fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Every single one of his aircraft was shot down. Not one torpedo hit a Japanese ship. Every man in Torpedo 8 was killed except for Ensign George Gay, who clung to a floating seat cushion in the water and watched the Battle of Midway unfold around him, staying submerged whenever Japanese ships passed. Waldron had known what he was flying into. He had written a letter to his wife before the mission. He had flown in anyway, because the mission required it. The sacrifice of Torpedo 8 and the other torpedo squadrons, Torpedo 6 from Enterprise and Torpedo 3 from Yorktown, were also cut apart, losing most of their aircraft, had pulled the Zero Combat Air Patrol down to the waves, and the sky above the Japanese carriers was empty. At 10:22 hours, McClusky transmitted his attack order. Almost simultaneously, Yorktown's Bombing Squadron 3 under Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie arrived over the Soryu. 3 squadrons of dive bombers, arriving over 3 Japanese carriers at almost exactly the same moment, was an accident of navigation, fuel curves, and desperate improvisation. The result, in those 5 minutes between 1022 and 1027 hours, was catastrophic for Japan and transformative for the war. Kaga took 3 to 5 direct bomb hits. One bomb struck directly on or in front of the bridge, killing Captain Jisaku Okada and most of her senior officers instantly. Fires raced through her hangar decks, where torpedoes and bombs were stacked unprotected. Akagi took 2 direct hits, Lieutenant Richard Best and his 2 wingmen, who had pulled out of their initial dive on Kaga, when they realized another squadron was attacking the same target, placed their bombs amidships on Akagi with precision that under the circumstances was almost miraculous. The resulting explosions were unlike anything the Japanese sailors had seen. Akagi, the flagship of the entire operation, was burning uncontrollably within minutes. Nagumo had to be physically dragged from his burning bridge by staff officers and transferred by rope to the light cruiser Nagara. He had lost his command. Soryu, struck by Leslie's bombing 3, took 3 direct hits within seconds and was abandoned within 20 minutes. 3 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, were effectively destroyed in 5 minutes. The 4th carrier, Hiryu, launched a counterstrike. Her aircraft found the USS Yorktown and bombed her, then hit her twice more with torpedoes. The Yorktown was abandoned, listing heavily. Later that afternoon, dive bombers from Enterprise found the Hiryu and put 4 bombs into her flight deck. Hiryu burned through the night and sank the following morning. Her commander, Rear Admiral Taemon Yamaguchi, chose to go down with his ship. Yamamoto canceled the Midway operation and withdrew west. The Yorktown, taken under tow and partially salvaged, was torpedoed and sunk on June 7th by the Japanese submarine E-168. The final accounting at Midway was stark. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, 1 heavy cruiser, 248 aircraft, and approximately 3,057 men, and including many of her most experienced and irreplaceable naval aviators. The United States lost 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, 147 aircraft, and 307 men. More than the numbers, what Midway destroyed was the Japanese offensive spirit in the Pacific. The highly trained, combat-seasoned aircrew who had flown from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean, men who had taken years to train and whom Japan could not replace quickly, were gone. From Midway forward, Japan would be on the strategic defensive. From Midway forward, the initiative in the Pacific War belonged to the United States. Admiral Nimitz later wrote that McClusky's decision to continue searching past the point of prudent calculation had decided the fate of the Pacific Fleet. But the mathematics of Midway cannot be separated from the sacrifice of John Waldron and the other torpedo bomber crews. They died so that McClusky's dive bombers could reach their targets unimpeded. That fact, the courage of the men who succeeded and the courage of the men who died making that success possible, is the moral arithmetic of Midway, and it runs through the entire war. The victory at Midway did not end the Pacific War. It merely changed its direction. The next battle would not be fought on the water. It would be fought in the jungle, on a forgotten island in the southwestern Pacific, in heat and mud and malaria and fear, by Marines and soldiers who had not bargained for any of it. The island was called Guadalcanal. Nobody who went there had ever heard of it before 1942. Nobody who fought there ever forgot it. Guadalcanal is a large island in the Solomon Islands chain, roughly 90 miles long and 25 miles wide, covered almost entirely by dense tropical jungle and mountains rising to 8,000 feet. What made it strategically vital was an airfield. In the summer of 1942, Japanese forces had begun constructing an airfield on the northern coastal plain near Lunga Point. If completed and operational, that airfield would extend Japanese air cover over the waters between Guadalcanal and Australia, threatening the supply lines that kept Australia functional as a base for any Allied counteroffensive. It had to be captured. On August 7, 1942, exactly 8 months after Pearl Harbor, approximately 11,000 men of the 1st Marine Division, commanded by Major General Alexander Vandegrift, landed on Guadalcanal in the first American amphibious offensive of the Second World War. The landing itself went well. The Japanese construction workers and light garrison offered little resistance and melted into the jungle. By August 8th, the Marines had captured the unfinished airfield and established a defensive perimeter at Lunga Point. They named the airfield Henderson Field, after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator killed at Midway. They completed the runway. They flew in aircraft, and then the Japanese came back in full force. The night of August 8th to 9th, a Japanese cruiser force under Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa came down what the Marines called the Slot, the narrow channel through the Solomon Islands, and executed one of the most devastating naval ambushes of the war. At the Battle of Savo Island, Mikawa's ships sank 4 Allied heavy cruisers, USS Quincy, USS Vincennes, USS Astoria, and HMAS Canberra, in under 30 minutes. Over 1,000 Allied sailors died. It was the worst defeat in a fair surface action in the history of the United States Navy. The transports carrying the Marines' food, ammunition, and heavy equipment turned and withdrew. The Marines were left alone on Guadalcanal with what they had carried ashore. What they had carried ashore was not enough for a sustained campaign. The Marines had approximately 17 days' worth of food, rationed immediately to 2 meals per day, limited ammunition, limited medical supplies, and the Japanese were coming. Not the light garrison that had been on the island before, but the full weight of the Imperial Japanese Army's 17th Army, and under Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, assigned to retake Guadalcanal. The Japanese were wrong about almost everything. They were wrong about the Marines. They were wrong about the airfield. They were wrong about American capacity to adapt and endure. Henderson Field was the key. As long as American aircraft flew from Henderson, the F-4F Wildcats, SBD Dauntlesses, and P-400 Airacobras of the Cactus Air Force, Japanese efforts to land reinforcements by daylight were near suicidal. Japan could only run supplies and troops to the island at night, using fast destroyers running down the slot, which the Marines nicknamed the Tokyo Express. The situation settled into a brutal rhythm. Japanese night bombardments of the airfield, American air attacks by day, Japanese infantry assaults at the perimeter by night, American counterattacks in the jungle, malaria, dengue fever, dysentery, fungal infections. The island's environment was killing men as fast as the enemy. The Marines' first significant test came in mid-August, when approximately 900 men under Colonel Ichiki Kiyonao charged the eastern perimeter along the Ilu River and were annihilated. Over 800 Japanese soldiers were killed. Ichiki burned his regiment's colors and killed himself. The next test came in September, when approximately 3,000 men under Major General Kawaguchi attempted to take Bloody Ridge, a long grassy ridge running south from the perimeter, in a night assault. Lieutenant Colonel Lewis Burwell Puller, Chesty Puller, who would become the most decorated Marine in Corps history, held the ridge with his battalion through repeated Japanese waves. The Japanese suffered approximately 1,200 killed. Puller received his second Navy Cross. The largest crisis came in mid-October, when Japanese battleships Kongo and Haruna subjected Henderson Field to a 90-minute night bombardment. Over 900 heavy shells struck the airfield complex. 41 aircraft were destroyed on the ground. Aviation fuel stocks were critically depleted. The following day, Marine pilots flew missions on fumes, literally draining fuel from wrecked aircraft to keep the surviving planes airborne. What kept Henderson Field alive was not superior equipment. It was individual stubbornness and professional skill maintained at the absolute edge of human endurance. The Japanese High Command launched its largest ground assault on October 24th to 25th, 1942. Seto General Hyakutake committed approximately 20,000 troops in a coordinated assault. The main effort struck Puller's battalion on the southern perimeter. Puller had 790 men. Against him came Japan's elite Sendai Division, with a battle record stretching back to 1937. Through the night, in rain and darkness, the Japanese attacked in repeated waves. Puller called in fire from every artillery piece that could range his position. walking fire up and down the approach routes with quiet precision at his field phone. Soldiers of the 164th Infantry Regiment, the first U.S. Army unit to reach Guadalcanal, filed in alongside Puller's Marines without orders, simply arriving at the right place and fighting because that was what was needed. By morning, over 1,500 Japanese soldiers lay dead in front of the American positions, at the airfield held. By mid-November, with the naval Battle of Guadalcanal, 3 engagements fought between November 12th and 15th in Iron Bottom Sound, the Japanese lost 2 battleships and 11 of 13 transport ships attempting to deliver the 38th Division to the island. Without heavy equipment and sustained logistical support, the Japanese ground forces on Guadalcanal were trapped. In December, the Japanese High Command made the decision to evacuate. On the nights of February 1st, 4th, and 7th, 1943, Japanese destroyers made 3 separate runs and extracted 11,000 emaciated survivors. On February 9th, 1943, 6 months and 2 days after the 1st Marine Division landed, Guadalcanal was declared secure. The cost was enormous. American ground forces lost 1,592 killed in action, with another 4,183 wounded. Yes, the Navy lost 24 ships sunk, and approximately 5,000 American sailors died in Iron Bottom Sound. Japan lost approximately 14,800 soldiers killed in action, another 9,000 dead of disease, and roughly 1,000 captured. Japanese naval losses included 2 battleships, a carrier, 3 cruisers, 12 destroyers, and 6 submarines. Guadalcanal mattered beyond the casualties. It was America's first offensive operation against Japan. It demonstrated that American infantry could take ground from Japanese infantry and hold it. It established the pattern of the island hopping campaign. And it validated the joint approach to warfare. Army and Marine infantry, naval fire support, land-based and carrier-based air power working together. That would become America's standard operating procedure for the rest of the Pacific War. While the Pacific Campaign was finding its footing on Guadalcanal, the European theater was also demanding attention. And in North Africa, in early 1943, that attention came at a steep price. Operation Torch had landed American forces on the shores of French Morocco and Algeria on November 8, 1942, the first large-scale American ground offensive in the European theater. After arranging an armistice with the Vichy French forces who opposed the landings, American, British, and French forces advanced east toward Tunisia, where German and Italian forces had retreated after the British 8th Army's victory at El Alamein. The plan was to catch Axis forces in a massive pincer, British from the east, Americans and their allies from the west. The American forces, primarily the Second Corps under Major General Lloyd Fredendall, were green and systematically unprepared. Fredendall had positioned his headquarters 70 miles behind the front lines in tunnels blasted into a cliff face, while his soldiers slept in the cold with inadequate gear forward. He had split his armor across a front 75 miles wide, violating every principle of armored concentration. He had never personally visited the front lines. He issued orders over the radio in a coded personal slang that his own officers found incomprehensible. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel arrived in Tunisia in mid-February 1943. He looked at the American dispositions and saw everything he needed. On February 14th, his 10th and 21st Panzer Divisions struck at Sidi Bouzid with complete surprise. Thus, American task forces were defeated in detail, one by one. On February 19th, the main Axis effort poured through Kasserine Pass, a 2-mile gap in the Grand Dorsal Mountains of west-central Tunisia. The defending force, too few men with inadequate anti-tank weapons against German Panzer IV and Tiger tanks, was overrun. American units fell back in disarray. The retreat covered 50 miles in 5 days. American casualties were approximately 6,500 killed, wounded, and missing, plus 183 tanks and 200 vehicles. Washington was stunned. The British were skeptical. Even Rommel, though he had driven the Americans back, noticed something. American artillery was effective, American logistics were abundant beyond anything Germany possessed, and the raw material of the American soldier was not poor, only the leadership and organization. Eisenhower moved immediately. He relieved Friedendahl and replaced him with Major General George S. Patton on March 6, 1943, fewer than 2 weeks after Kasserine. He reorganized the entire Allied command structure in North Africa and ordered new doctrine for air-ground cooperation. Patton took command of 2nd Corps and transformed it within days. He imposed discipline and professional standards at every level with ferocity that his soldiers both resented and needed. He visited the front lines constantly. He demanded that his officers know their sectors and their soldiers. 11 days after Patton assumed command, when his corps went back on the offensive at El Gueter on March 17th, it performed completely differently than it had at Kasserine. When the 10th Panzer Division attacked, American anti-tank guns and artillery, properly concentrated this time, destroyed dozens of tanks. It was a different army than the one that had fled through Kasserine 3 weeks earlier. By early May 1943, Allied forces had closed the pincer. On May 13, 1943, the final Axis resistance in North Africa collapsed. Approximately 250,000 German and Italian soldiers surrendered, more prisoners in a single capitulation than the Soviets had taken at Stalingrad 3 months earlier. Among those captured were the entire staff of the Afrika Korps and the remnants of some of Germany's finest formations. The campaign had been costly, but it had educated the American army in ways that no amount of stateside training could have matched. The survivors of North Africa would become the backbone of the army that fought across Sicily, up the Italian peninsula, and eventually across France, into Germany itself. The next major step was Sicily. Operation Husky launched on July 9, 1943. American paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne dropped into Sicily at night in badly scattered formations. Small groups of paratroopers appeared across an enormous area of the island, far from their intended drop zones. Their scattered presence created genuine confusion among the defenders across a wide area, disrupting counterattack preparations. Patton's 7th Army landed on the southern coast. Within 38 days, Sicily was in Allied hands. The political consequence was immediate. On July 25, 1943, the Italian king dismissed Mussolini from power and had him arrested. Fascist Italy, which Mussolini had led since 1922, was collapsing from within. Italy surrendered formally on September 8, 1943, as though German forces immediately disarmed Italian units, occupied the peninsula, and established defensive lines that would hold Allied forces in costly, grinding combat for nearly 2 more years. The Italian campaign, up through the mountains in autumn and winter, through the Gustav Line at Monte Cassino, through the Anzio landing and its months of bloody stalemate, is one of the most grueling chapters of the entire war. Rome was liberated on June 4, 1944, 2 days before D-Day, and then came June 6th. The planning for Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of France, had been underway since 1942, in earnest since 1943. General Eisenhower arrived in Britain in January 1944 as Supreme Allied Commander to take command of the most complex military operation ever attempted. The scale defied easy comprehension, and every beach on the Normandy coast had been studied in photographic intelligence. Every German position had been mapped and analyzed. The Atlantic Wall, bunkers, artillery emplacements, sea obstacles, mines, and concrete barriers stretching from Norway to the Spanish border had been examined in exhaustive detail. The plan called for landing 5 divisions on 5 beaches simultaneously, with airborne divisions dropping behind the beaches to secure the flanks. The logistics required to support the operation were staggering. Artificial harbors, the Mulberry harbors, were prefabricated in Britain and towed across the English Channel. A pipeline, Pluto, pipeline under the ocean, was designed to pump fuel under the Channel floor. 2 million Allied soldiers, sailors, and airmen were assembled in southern England by June 1944. All the deception operation, Fortitude, had convinced the German High Command that the main landing would come at the Pas de Calais, not Normandy, tying down the powerful German 15th Army 100 miles from where the actual invasion would land. Field Marshal Rommel, commanding the Atlantic Wall defenses, had spent the months before D-Day improving the beach defenses with characteristic energy. He ordered millions of additional mines laid on the beaches. He ordered wooden stakes with mines or artillery shells, attached driven into the tidal flats and shallow water, designed to tear the bottoms out of landing craft. He ordered metal anti-tank obstacles positioned throughout the surf zones. He believed, correctly, that the decisive moment would be the first hours of the invasion. Yea, he pressed his superiors for armored reserves to be positioned close enough to the beaches to counterattack within hours. His superiors disagreed. That argument was never fully resolved, and the German failure to position their panzer reserves correctly would prove fatal to the defense of Normandy. In England, the invasion was delayed 24 hours by weather. The meteorologist attached to SHAEF predicted a narrow window of marginally acceptable weather on June 6th. Eisenhower, sitting with his commanders at Southwick House near Portsmouth on the night of June 4th, listened to the forecast, listened to the arguments, sat quietly for a moment and said, "Okay, we'll go." The order went out. The largest armada in the history of warfare began moving toward France. The airborne assault began shortly after midnight on June 6th. Said American paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions dropped into Normandy beginning at approximately 0100 hours. The drops were chaotic. Strong winds and cloud cover scattered paratroopers across an area miles wider than planned. Men came down in flooded fields, in villages, in orchards, in churchyards, in rivers. Officers found themselves with 5 men instead of 50, a mile from the nearest friendly soldiers. Individual paratroopers scrambled through the Norman darkness, finding each other by the clicking of metal crickets issued as recognition devices, assembling into improvised groups of strangers who had no maps for where they were, but knew what they needed to do. Despite the confusion, the airborne troops achieved their essential objectives. The 101st Airborne Division secured the exits from Utah Beach, in allowing the amphibious force to move inland rather than being channeled through flooded low ground under fire. The 82nd Airborne Division seized Sainte-Mère-Église, the first French town liberated on D-Day, and disrupted German communications across the Cotentin Peninsula. British 6th Airborne captured the Pegasus Bridge over the Guadalcanal intact in a glider assault still studied in military academies as a model of precision planning and audacious execution. At 0630 hours, the amphibious assault began across all 5 beaches. On most beaches, the landing went better than the most pessimistic planners had feared. Utah Beach saw the 4th Infantry Division come ashore in the wrong place. Their landing craft had drifted south of the intended landing zone, and that mistake turned out to be fortunate, not because the sector where they actually landed was less heavily defended. The 4th Division lost 197 casualties at Utah Beach, the lightest toll of any beach on D-Day. It was the exception. Omaha Beach was nearly a catastrophe. Omaha was a crescent-shaped beach roughly 6 miles wide, backed by bluffs rising from 100 to 170 feet, capped by German positions whose actual strength had been significantly underestimated. The veteran German 352nd Infantry Division was positioned directly behind Omaha. It had not shown up in pre-invasion intelligence assessments. The plan called for air bombardment to destroy the beach defenses before the infantry landed. The bombardment was almost entirely ineffective. Bombers had delayed their release points to avoid hitting their own troops visible below the cloud cover, and their bombs fell miles inland hitting nothing. The naval bombardment was too brief. When the first landing craft approached the beach at 0630, the German defenders were alive, armed, rested, and in position. The first waves at Omaha Beach were shredded. The 1st Infantry Division and 29th Infantry Division were the assault divisions. Their landing craft lowered ramps in the surf, and the men who stepped off stepped into machine gun fire, mortar fire, and artillery fire covering every foot of the beach. In some sectors, casualties in the first 15 minutes exceeded 50%. Company A of the 116th Infantry Regiment landed directly in front of a German strongpoint, and in the first minutes, nearly every officer and NCO was hit. Men died in the surf, dragged under by their equipment. Men died at the waterline. And men died crossing the open beach below the bluffs. 27 of the 29 duplex drive Sherman tanks launched offshore sank before reaching the beach. Their crews died with them. The bluffs had to be climbed. There was no other way. The strong points on the heights had to be reduced from the flanks and from above by men who had to first cross the open sand to reach them. It took until mid-afternoon before the German defenses at Omaha were broken enough to allow consistent movement inland. The soldiers who crossed that beach and got up those bluffs did it by advancing through fire, one step at a time, in a dozen improvised groups, operating on the instinct that the only direction that made sense was forward. Brigadier General Norman Cota, Assistant Division Commander of the 29th, walked the beach under fire. Our rallied men who had taken cover at the seawall and reportedly told them, "Two kinds of people are staying on this beach, the dead and those who are going to die. Now let's get the hell out of here." They moved. American casualties at Omaha Beach on June 6th were approximately 2,000 killed, wounded, and missing, the heaviest of any beach. Total Allied casualties across all 5 beaches were over 10,000, of which approximately 4,414 were killed, including 2,501 Americans. But by nightfall on June 6, 1944, all 5 beaches were in Allied hands. The Atlantic Wall had been breached. More than 156,000 Allied soldiers were ashore in France. The liberation of Western Europe had begun. The weeks that followed D-Day were not a clean advance. German resistance in the Norman bocage, the dense network of hedgerows, sunken lanes, and walled fields covering the Normandy countryside was tenacious and costly. American infantry discovered quickly that the bocage terrain negated their advantages in mobility and firepower. German defenders could hold each hedgerow line with small forces, inflicting heavy casualties on attackers working their way through one field at a time. It took weeks of bitter fighting and the Rhino device, steel prongs welded onto Sherman tanks to cut through hedgerow roots, before the tactical stalemate was broken. On July 25th, Operation Cobra launched, nearly 2,500 Allied aircraft bombing a narrow corridor on the German front line, the most concentrated air attack in the history of warfare to that point. The bombardment shattered the German defenses. American forces flooded through the gap. Patton's Third Army, activated August 1st, has swept south and east across France in one of the great armored advances of the war, 200 miles in 2 weeks, bypassing and encircling German formations, liberating city after city, moving so fast that Patton's headquarters used aircraft to keep up with his tank columns. Paris was liberated on August 25, 1944. By September, Allied forces had advanced to the German border. By October, they were fighting on German soil. Hitler's final strategic gamble came in December 1944. On December 16th, more than 200,000 German troops and approximately 1,000 tanks launched Operation Watch on the Rhine through the forests of the Ardennes in Belgium and Luxembourg. The attack achieved complete tactical surprise. The German penetration, the Bulge, drove 50 miles into Allied lines in the first days, threatening to split the American and British armies and capture the critical port of Antwerp. It was the largest single battle in American military history, and it would become the bloodiest. The decisive point was Bastogne, a small Belgian town at the junction of 7 roads in the Ardennes highlands. Whoever controlled Bastogne controlled movement through the entire region. Eisenhower ordered the Schaeff Reserve, the 82nd Airborne Division and the 101st Airborne Division resting near Reims, to move immediately. The 101st had no trucks. They rode north in open trucks through freezing rain and sleet on the night of December 18th to 19th, 107 miles to Bastogne, arriving just hours before German armored forces closed the ring around the town. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe commanded the 101st at Bastogne. The division's senior commander was in Washington at a conference. McAuliffe had 4 airborne regiments, 7 battalions of artillery, Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division, and various attached units inside his perimeter. Outside, 3 German divisions were hammering the perimeter from every direction. Through December 20th, 21st, and 22nd, the 101st held. Ammunition was running short, food was running short, medical supplies were running dangerously low. The weather was overcast and freezing. Fog and cloud that grounded Allied aircraft denied American fighter bombers their killing advantage and gave the German armor freedom of movement. On December 22nd, a delegation of German officers delivered a formal surrender ultimatum under a flag of truce. McAuliffe's written response was a single word: nuts. The weather cleared on December 23rd. 241 C-47 transport aircraft flew through anti-aircraft fire and dropped supplies into the perimeter by parachute. P-47 Thunderbolts began attacking German positions throughout the Bulge. The artillery, resupplied, fired in full earnest again. On December 26th, at 16:45 hours, the lead elements of Patton's Third Army reached the Bastogne perimeter and broke the siege. The Battle of the Bulge lasted 41 days. American casualties exceeded 76,000 killed, wounded, and missing, the largest single battle loss in American military history. The 101st Airborne Division alone suffered 341 killed, 1,691 wounded, and 516 missing in the Bastogne fight. Germany's losses were comparable in numbers but catastrophic in strategic terms. The loss of its last significant reserve of armored forces on the Western Front. After the Bulge, Germany had nothing left to stop the Allied advance. The crossing of the Rhine began in March 1945. On March 7th, soldiers of the 9th Armored Division discovered the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen still standing. German demolition charges had failed to fully detonate and fought their way across under fire. Within a week, 5 divisions were on the east bank of the Rhine. Germany was now open. American forces swept east and south through Germany through March and April 1945. On April 25th, American and Soviet soldiers met at the Elbe River near Torgau, shaking hands across the water that divided east from west. Hitler was in his bunker in Berlin, issuing orders to armies that no longer existed. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler shot himself. On May 8th, 1945, Germany signed its unconditional surrender. The war in Europe was over. In the Pacific, the campaign was entering its final and most violent phase. The island-hopping campaign had moved steadily northwest from Guadalcanal through 1943 and 1944, each island assault more difficult than the last. The Mariana Islands fell in the summer of 1944, Saipan, Tinian, Guam, giving the Army Air Force's bases within B-29 Superfortress bombing range of the Japanese home islands. By late 1944, hundreds of B-29s were flying combat missions against Japanese cities, burning them one by one with incendiary attacks that created firestorms visible from 30 miles. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, destroyed Japanese carrier aviation as a meaningful military force. In 2 days of combat, Japanese naval air groups lost nearly 500 aircraft and most of their experienced pilots. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, as American aviators called the engagement, was the final destruction of Japan's ability to project carrier-based air power. 3 Japanese carriers were sunk. Japanese air groups that had taken years to train were gone in hours. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, fought as MacArthur's forces landed on the Philippine island of Leyte, was the largest naval battle in the history of human warfare. Over 218 ships participated on both sides, directly engaging over 200,000 naval personnel across 100,000 square miles of ocean from October 23rd to October 26th. Japan committed virtually its entire remaining fleet in a desperate multi-pronged attempt to destroy the American invasion force. The plan was sophisticated. A decoy force of carriers with almost no aircraft would draw Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet north, while powerful surface forces converged on the landing area. The component that nearly succeeded was the central force under Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita. 4 battleships, including the massive Yamato, the largest battleship ever built at 72,000 tons and armed with 18-inch guns, plus a powerful force of cruisers and destroyers. When Kurita emerged from San Bernardino Strait in the pre-dawn darkness of October 25th, Halsey had been successfully decoyed north. He found himself facing only Taffy 3, 6 small escort carriers, and a handful of destroyers and destroyer escorts, the most lightly armed group in the entire American fleet. What happened next in the waters off Samar is one of the most extraordinary naval engagements in history. The escort carriers turned away and ran, launching aircraft with whatever ordnance was available. Some aircraft with no bombs at all, just strafing runs. The destroyers and destroyer escorts, tiny ships armed with 5-inch guns against the Yamato's 18-inch main battery, charged Kurita's force at full speed, firing torpedoes, laying smoke, drawing fire from battleships and cruisers that could have reduced them to wreckage in minutes. The destroyer, USS Johnston, Commander Ernest Evans commanding, closed to within 9,000 yards of the Yamato and fired all 10 torpedoes before her engines were blown off and she began sinking. Evans, mortally wounded, was last seen directing the men loading ammunition as Johnston sank. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. The destroyers and aircraft of Taffy 3, through sheer aggression and the smoke and confusion of battle, convinced Kurita that he was engaging a major fleet force rather than a handful of escort carriers. Unable to communicate clearly with his subordinate commanders, mistaking the destroyers' suicidal charges for the organized attacks of fleet destroyers, Kurita made his fatal decision. He broke off the action and withdrew. He had been within range of the landing beaches, within range of the transports and their thousands of soldiers, within range of destroying the entire Philippines invasion. He turned back. By the end of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Japan had lost 4 aircraft carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers, essentially its remaining offensive naval power. The Imperial Japanese Navy never again mounted a coordinated offensive operation. The battle also marked the first organized use of kamikaze aircraft, Japanese pilots who deliberately crashed their bomb-laden planes into American ships, accepting certain death. The escort carrier St. Lo was the first major warship sunk by kamikaze attack on October 25, 1944. And the kamikaze campaign intensified through the final year of the war, and by its end had sunk 34 American ships and damaged hundreds more, killing nearly 5,000 American sailors. They could not change the outcome, but they extracted a real price, and the price they promised to exact in an invasion of the Japanese home islands, where hundreds of thousands of aircraft had been reserved for suicide missions, where civilian populations were being trained to resist, shaped the most consequential decision of the war. Iwo Jima fell in March 1945 after 36 days of combat. Nearly 7,000 Marines killed, nearly 20,000 wounded, to capture an island 8 square miles in area defended by 22,000 Japanese fighters who operated almost entirely from an underground network of tunnels and bunkers, years in construction. The iconic photograph of Marines raising the American flag on Mount Suribachi was taken on February 23, 1945. 4 days into the battle, when Suribachi was taken, but the fighting had barely begun. 3 of the 6 men in that photograph were killed in the subsequent fighting before the island was secured. Okinawa fell in June 1945 after nearly 3 months of combat, the longest, bloodiest, most costly battle in the Pacific War. 12,000 Americans were killed and over 38,000 were wounded. Approximately 100,000 Japanese military defenders were killed. Over 100,000 Okinawan civilians died, caught in the fighting, ordered to kill themselves by Japanese soldiers, or driven to the island's southern cliffs where thousands chose to leap rather than be captured. The cost of taking Okinawa gave American planners a clear and terrible preview of what an invasion of the Japanese home islands would cost. Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan, was scheduled to begin in November 1945. American planners estimated potential American battle casualties between 250,000 and 1 million, and Japanese casualties, military and civilian combined, that could exceed several million. These projections shaped the ultimate decision. On August 6, 1945, a B-29 superfortress named Enola Gay, piloted by Colonel Paul Tibbets, took off from Tinian and flew north toward the Japanese home islands. At 08:15 hours, the Enola Gay's bombardier released a uranium gun-type atomic bomb, codenamed Little Boy, over Hiroshima. The bomb detonated at approximately 1,900 feet altitude. The yield was approximately 15 kilotons, equivalent to 15,000 tons of conventional explosive. The blast destroyed approximately 5 square miles of the city in seconds. Between 70,000 and 80,000 people died in the initial explosion and immediate aftermath. By the end of 1945, with deaths from radiation sickness and injuries continuing, the toll reached approximately 90,000 to 140,000. Japan did not immediately surrender. On August 9th, a B-29 named Boxcar dropped a plutonium implosion bomb, Fat Man, on Nagasaki. The yield was approximately 21 kilotons. Between 40,000 and 80,000 people died. On the same day, the Soviet Union launched a massive invasion of Japanese-held Manchuria. 1 million Soviet soldiers crossing the border simultaneously, overwhelming the Kwantung Army, at which Japan had considered its strategic reserve. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito broadcast a recorded message to the Japanese people, announcing that Japan would accept unconditional surrender. It was the first time most Japanese citizens had ever heard their emperor's voice. On September 2, 1945, at 09:02 hours Tokyo time, the formal surrender ceremony was held on the deck of the USS Missouri, anchored in Tokyo Bay. General Douglas MacArthur presided. Japanese Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu signed for Japan. General Richard Sutherland signed for the Allied powers. Allied commanders from every nation that had fought Japan watched from the deck. MacArthur spoke briefly. Then he declared the proceedings closed. The Second World War was over. The United States had fought in the Pacific for 3 years, 8 months, and then 25 days from Pearl Harbor to the Missouri ceremony. It had fought in Europe from November 1942 to May 1945. In that time, the United States Army had grown from fewer than 200,000 men in 1939 to over 8 million in 1945. The Navy had grown from 17 capital ships to over 1,200 warships. American industry, mobilized completely for war production, had produced in 4 years more than 300,000 aircraft, more than 100,000 tanks and armored vehicles, thousands of warships, and quantities of ammunition, fuel, food, and equipment that exceeded the combined production of Germany, Japan, and Italy combined. The Lend-Lease program had transferred over $50 billion in 1945 currency in equipment and supplies to Allied nations. The human cost was enormous. Over 405,000 Americans died in World War II, 291,557 in battle, and the remainder from disease, accidents, and the privations of captivity. More than 670,000 Americans were wounded in action. More than 140,000 American prisoners of war suffered captivity under conditions that ranged from harsh to deliberately murderous. Japanese treatment of prisoners involved systematic abuse, forced labor, starvation, and deliberate killing that resulted in thousands of Americans dying in captivity. The Patton Death March of April 1942, in which approximately 75,000 American and Filipino prisoners were force-marched 65 miles in brutal heat with deliberate cruelty from Japanese guards, killed between 500 and 650 Americans and thousands of Filipinos on the march itself. Thousands more died in the subsequent prison camps. And yet, set against those costs is what the costs achieved. Germany surrendered on May 8th. It is 1945. Italy had effectively left the war in September 1943. Japan surrendered on September 2nd, 1945. Three nations that had launched aggressive wars of conquest across two hemispheres, that had together killed tens of millions of human beings and enslaved hundreds of millions more, had been decisively defeated. The Holocaust, the systematic industrial murder of 6 million Jewish people and millions of others by the Nazi regime, was ended by the Allied advance into Germany. The Japanese Empire's brutal subjugation of hundreds of millions of people across East Asia and the Pacific was ended by Japan's surrender. What America accomplished between December 7, 1941, and September 2, 1945 has no precise parallel in the history of modern warfare. A nation that entered the conflict with a peacetime military, without extensive battle experience in the modern idiom, without a fully converted industrial base for total war, transformed itself in less than 4 years into the most powerful military force the world had ever seen. It did so through industrial capacity that staggered its enemies, who had calculated that American democracy was too soft, too comfortable, too divided to mobilize effectively, through democratic energy, institutional adaptability, and the courage and skill of the individual soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines who did the actual fighting. McClusky survived Midway. He was awarded the Navy Cross for his decision to continue searching past the point of prudent calculation. He continued to serve in the Pacific, was badly wounded in 1943, and survived the war. John Waldron, who led Torpedo Squadron 8 into the Japanese combat air patrol at Midway, knowing his obsolete TBD Devastators had almost no chance against the Zeros, did not survive. He was killed with almost all of his men. Their sacrifice cleared the sky for McClusky's dive bombers. The mathematics of Midway cannot be separated from that sacrifice. Chesty Puller survived Guadalcanal, survived the Pacific War, survived Korea, and became the most decorated Marine in the history of the Corps, earning 5 Navy Crosses. Anthony McAuliffe survived the Bulge, survived the war, rose to 4-star rank, and served as Commander-in-Chief U.S. Army Europe. He died in 1975. George Patton survived the Bulge and the crossing of the Rhine, survived the end of the war in Europe, and died in December 1945 from injuries sustained in an automobile accident in occupied Germany, a death that seemed impossibly anticlimactic to the men who had watched him command from the front for 3 years. Dwight Eisenhower became the 34th President of the United States. Chester Nimitz became Fleet Admiral of the United States Navy and was present on the deck of the Missouri when Japan surrendered, placing his signature on the surrender document. The men who did not come home, the 405,000 Americans killed, and the millions of Allied dead in Europe and the Pacific and North Africa are the final measure of what America's World War II triumphs cost. They are also the final measure of what those triumphs were worth. But every generation that has lived in a world without Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, every person in Western Europe who chose their own governments, every person in East Asia not absorbed into a Japanese empire, has lived in that world because of what those men and women did between 1941 and 1945. The story does not belong to generals and admirals, though they matter enormously. It belongs to McClusky following a destroyer's white wake across a Pacific he almost didn't have the fuel to search. It belongs to Waldron leading his torpedo bombers into the teeth of the Japanese combat air patrol because the mission required it. It belongs to the unnamed Marine on Bloody Ridge, firing until his ammunition ran out and then fixing his bayonet. Whilst it belongs to the soldier at Omaha Beach who kept moving across the sand when every instinct said, "Lie down and stay down," who got off the beach and up the bluff and took the strong point, and thereby opened a gap through which other men poured. It belongs to the screaming eagles in their frozen foxholes in the Ardennes, surrounded, running low on ammunition, being asked to surrender, and answering, "Nuts." It belongs to every American woman who took her husband's place in a factory producing B-24 bombers or Sherman tanks or artillery shells, who learned in 6 weeks skills that previously required years of apprenticeship, who kept the production lines running that made all of it possible. It belongs to the soldiers who came home broken and were never fully understood. And it belongs to the soldiers who did not come home at all. Should the scale of what happened between 1941 and 1945 resists easy comprehension. Numbers that large, 50 million dead worldwide, 2 billion people affected, the destruction of entire nations, collapse into abstraction if you let them. But they were not abstractions to the people who lived them. Every number was a person. Every person had a name. Every name had a story. And if this account has captured even a fragment of that reality, the weight of what those people were up against, the uncertainty of the outcome, the cost of the choices that were made, then it has done what stories are supposed to do. It has made the past feel present. It has made the sacrifice feel real. It has made clear that the world we live in was not given to us. It was built, at enormous cost, by people who had no guarantee of success and went ahead anyway. McClusky pressed on past the point of prudent calculation. Waldron flew into the fire. The men on Omaha Beach kept moving. The paratroopers at Bastogne said nuts. And somehow, against everything that the mathematics of December 1941 would have suggested, against the logic of a world in which 3 of history's most powerful military machines had just turned their full force against a nation that was not prepared for any of them, they won. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe. Your support helps us bring more forgotten stories to light. Tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? The Pacific War did not exist in isolation. While Marines were dying on Guadalcanal and soldiers were learning their trade in the mud of Tunisia, yet another war was being fought in the Atlantic. A war that received less attention in the history books, but that was, in its own way, just as decisive. If the Atlantic lifeline had been cut, if German submarines had succeeded in strangling the supply routes between North America and Britain, the entire premise of Germany First would have been academic. There could have been no overlord without a Britain that was intact and armed. There could have been no North Africa without the convoys that kept the Eighth Army supplied. The Battle of the Atlantic, fought from September 1939 to May 1945, the longest continuous campaign of the entire war, was the foundation on which everything else rested. Germany's submarine fleet, the U-Bootwaffe under Admiral Karl Dönitz, had been refining its tactics since the first days of the war. Yet by late 1941 and through 1942, U-boats were operating in American coastal waters with devastating effectiveness, taking advantage of America's initial failure to institute convoy systems or enforce coastal blackouts. Ships silhouetted against the lights of Atlantic City and Miami were easy targets. In the 6 months after Pearl Harbor, German submarines sank over 400 ships in American coastal waters, a period U-boat crews called the Second Happy Time. Tankers bringing oil from the Gulf of Mexico to the East Coast refineries were particularly vulnerable. At one point in early 1942, sinkings were occurring at a rate that outpaced new construction. The arithmetic was simple and terrifying. If sinkings continued at that pace, Britain would run out of food, fuel, and ammunition. The response was organizational and technological. As the United States instituted mandatory convoy systems in May 1942, requiring merchant ships to travel in groups with naval escorts rather than independently. New escort vessels, destroyer escorts, corvettes, frigates, were built at American yards in increasing numbers. Long-range patrol aircraft, particularly the PB-4Y Liberator, began closing the mid-Atlantic gap, the area of ocean beyond the range of land-based aircraft from either shore where U-boats had previously operated freely. Centimeter wavelength radar, small enough to fit in aircraft, allowed patrol planes to detect submarines on the surface at night. High-frequency direction-finding equipment allowed escorts to locate submarines by their radio transmissions. By mid-1943, the combination of these technologies and organizational improvements had shifted the balance decisively. In May 1943 alone, the Allies sank 41 U-boats. Dönitz temporarily withdrew his submarines from the North Atlantic. The crisis was over. The supply lines to Britain and the Mediterranean remained open. The grand strategy could proceed. The air war against Germany was running in parallel with all of this. The American daylight precision bombing campaign that the Army Air Forces had been planning since before the war, based on the conviction that high-altitude daylight bombing by self-defending formations of B-17 and B-24 bombers could destroy the German industrial and transportation infrastructure without the need for the massive area bombing at night that the Royal Air Force was conducting. The theory was logical. The practice was catastrophic at first. German fighter defenses, the Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s of the Jagdwaffe, the German Air Defense Command, and the integrated radar and ground control system that directed them, tore into the American bomber formations at a cost that the 8th Air Force, based in England, found very nearly unsustainable. The disasters came in October 1943. On October 14, 1943, known as Black Thursday in the 8th Air Force, 291 B-17 flying fortresses flew to Schweinfurt, Germany, to attack the ball-bearing factories whose products were essential to every moving mechanism in the German war machine. The Luftwaffe put up everything it had. German fighters attacked the bomber formations from assembly to target to withdrawal. 60 B-17 were shot down. Another 17 were so badly damaged they never flew again. A crews on the surviving aircraft counted the holes in their planes and understood what had happened. The 8th Air Force suspended deep penetration raids into Germany while it figured out what to do. The answer, which arrived in February 1944 in the form of the North American P-51 Mustang fitted with drop tanks that extended its range, was the long-range escort fighter. The P-51 Mustang could fly to Berlin and back with a bomber formation and outfight anything the Luftwaffe had in the air. From February 1944 forward, the Luftwaffe was fighting for the survival of German airspace over Germany itself, not over England or France. Operation Argument. Big Week, as 8th Air Force crews called it, ran from February 20th to 25th, 1944. Yes, American and British bombers flew over 3,000 sorties against German aircraft factories across a 6-day period. German fighter production was temporarily disrupted. More importantly, the German fighter force rose to defend its factories and suffered losses in combat that it could not replace as quickly as the Americans could replace theirs. The mathematics of attrition, which had favored Germany during the dark days of 1943, were shifting. By the time of Overlord in June 1944, the Luftwaffe had been so badly weakened by months of aerial combat over Germany that it could barely contest the Normandy skies. On D-Day itself, the Luftwaffe flew only a handful of sorties over the beaches. The Allied air forces flew nearly 15,000. Yet the price paid in the skies over Schweinfurt and Regensburg and Berlin by American bomber crews through 1943 and early 1944 had bought the air superiority that made Overlord possible. Behind the air campaign, behind the naval campaign, behind the ground campaigns in North Africa and Sicily and Italy and France and the Pacific, was a mobilization effort that was, in retrospect, almost incomprehensible in its scale and speed. In September 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, the United States Army had approximately 190,000 soldiers, a force that ranked 19th in the world, behind Romania. By the end of 1941, the draft that had been authorized in 1940 had expanded the Army to 1.6 million. By 1943, 8 million men and women were under arms. By the end of the war, over 16 million Americans had served in the armed forces. The industrial story matched the military story. In 1940, the United States produced fewer than 1,000 military aircraft. In 1944, it produced 96,000. In 1940, the United States produced 331 tanks. In 1944, it produced over 17,000. The shipbuilding numbers were even more dramatic. Under the Emergency Shipbuilding Program, American yards produced Liberty ships, standardized cargo vessels that could be built by workers with no previous shipbuilding experience, at a rate that eventually reached one ship every 42 days per yard, and then faster. The technique of prefabrication, welding pre-built sections together on the ways, rather than building ships rivet by rivet from the keel up, cut construction times from years to months to weeks. Henry Kaiser's yards in California and Oregon set production records that shipbuilders in other countries found literally unbelievable when they heard them. The women who entered the American workforce during the war years were indispensable to this production. By 1944, over 6 million American women were working in war industries, in aircraft plants, shipyards, ordnance factories, steel mills. The cultural image of Rosie the Riveter, the confident, competent woman worker in her factory uniform, was not a piece of propaganda. It was a description of a real transformation in American society. Women who had never held industrial tools were welding fuselage sections, operating lathes, loading artillery shells, testing electrical systems in fighter aircraft. Yet they learned in weeks what their male predecessors had learned in years of apprenticeship, and they produced work of the quality the war required. The logistics of moving all of this production, the food, the ammunition, the fuel, the spare parts, the vehicles, the aircraft, the weapons, the men, across 2 oceans to fighting forces spread across the globe was itself a military operation of enormous complexity. The American logistics system, built largely from scratch after Pearl Harbor, was by 1944 moving more tonnage per month than the entire global merchant fleet had moved per year in the 1930s. The transportation network within the United States, railroads, highways, river barges, was strained to its limits and held together largely by the organizational skill of military and civilian logistics officers who invented solutions as they went. The port facilities on both coasts, East Coast for Europe, West Coast for the Pacific, were expanded, modernized, and operated around the clock 7 days a week. The medical system tells part of the story too. The development of sulfa drugs and penicillin during the war years saved enormous numbers of soldiers who would have died of infected wounds in any previous conflict. Blood banking, which allowed whole blood and plasma to be stored and transported to forward areas, saved men who would have died of blood loss in hours. Forward surgical teams, small mobile units that could operate in tents close to the front lines, reduced the time between wounding and definitive surgical treatment from hours to minutes in many cases. Wounds that killed soldiers in World War I were survivable in World War II. The survival rate for American soldiers wounded in combat was, by the end of the war, dramatically higher than it had been in any previous conflict in history. That translated directly into men who recovered, returned to their units, and fought again. The intelligence picture mattered enormously throughout the war, in ways that were not publicly known for decades after it ended. The breaking of the German Enigma cipher, the work done at Bletchley Park in Britain by Alan Turing and the team of cryptanalysts and mathematicians who worked with him, it building on earlier work by Polish intelligence officers who had cracked earlier versions of the code, gave the Allies access to German operational communications at a level that was sometimes tactically decisive. The decrypts, called Ultra, told Allied commanders when and where German offensives were coming, what the enemy knew and didn't know about Allied intentions, what the logistics situation was inside the German armed forces. Ultra did not win the war by itself. The intelligence had to be acted on correctly, and sometimes it wasn't. But it gave Allied commanders an advantage that, as Eisenhower would later say, shortened the war by years. The breaking of JN-25, the Japanese naval code, gave Nimitz the intelligence that made Midway possible, as described earlier. But it also contributed to hundreds of other operational decisions throughout the Pacific War. The interception and decryption of a Japanese signal in April 1943 that gave the precise itinerary of Admiral Yamamoto's inspection tour of forward bases in the Solomon Islands led directly to Operation Vengeance, a precisely timed long-range ambush by 16 P-38 Lightning fighters that intercepted Yamamoto's transport aircraft over Bougainville and shot it down, killing the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and the most capable operational commander in the Imperial Japanese Navy. The Japanese never understood how their communications had been compromised. They continued using codes that the Americans and their allies were reading throughout the war. The racial dimension of the American war effort is inseparable from its history. Had the United States fought a war for freedom and democracy while maintaining a legally segregated military in which African-American soldiers served in separate units under predominantly white officers, were denied promotion to senior ranks in most circumstances, and faced discrimination in every aspect of their military service. The 332nd Fighter Group, the Tuskegee Airmen, flew more than 1,500 combat missions in the Mediterranean and European theaters, escorting bomber formations and compiling a combat record that was extraordinary by any measure. The 92nd Infantry Division fought in Italy. The 761st Tank Battalion, commanded by black officers, fought with Patton's Third Army in the Battle of the Bulge. Japanese-American soldiers, Nisei, second-generation Japanese Americans, many of whom had family members sitting in American internment camps, served in the 442nd Regimental Combat Team in Italy, becoming the most decorated unit in the history of the United States Army for their size and length of service. They fought for a country that had imprisoned their families. The contradiction was not lost on them. It is not lost on history. The combat experience of soldiers in the Second World War was, at its core, defined by fear. Every soldier who served in a combat role understood what the statistics meant. In a rifle company in sustained heavy combat, the expected casualty rate over a period of weeks made survival feel like a matter of chance. Studies done during and after the war found that the most experienced soldiers, the ones who had been in combat longest, were often the most debilitated psychologically, if not the least. Combat exhaustion, what a later generation would call post-traumatic stress disorder, was a medical condition recognized during the war and treated imperfectly in forward psychiatric units. Division after division struggled with the problem of men who had simply been in combat too long. The solution in many cases was more men, replacements fed into the front line to absorb the casualties and allow the veterans to rest, if there was any rest to be had. The experience of combat at the individual level resists the kind of narrative that histories tend to construct. The large-scale descriptions, 3,000 men attacked in a 900-meter-wide sector, do not capture what those men experienced. What they experienced was fear so intense it was a physical sensation. It was the smell of cordite and burned flesh. It was the confusion of movement under fire when the plan from the briefing room disappeared within the first 30 seconds of contact, and what was left was instinct, training, and the faces of the men beside you. It was the strange arithmetic of survival in which men died for reasons that had nothing to do with their courage or skill. A mortar round that fell here rather than there, a sniper who had a clear line of sight to this man and not the one beside him. Veterans of infantry combat have a tendency, when they speak about it at all, to insist that the history books are wrong, not in the facts they describe, but in the coherence they impose. Real combat was not coherent. Real combat was noise and chaos and occasional clarity and long stretches of terror, punctuated by sudden extreme violence. Yes, the histories reconstruct a meaning that the participants were rarely able to perceive at the time, and yet meaning there was. In the Pacific, it came from the understanding, clear even to the most junior soldier or Marine, that what Japan had done, what Japan was doing in China, in the Philippines, in the occupied territories of Southeast Asia, was a thing that had to be stopped. American soldiers in the Pacific did not need political speeches to explain why they were fighting. They had Pearl Harbor. They had the Bataan Death March, news of which reached American forces through 1942 and hardened attitudes that were already hard. They had the evidence of their own experience in combat with an enemy that fought with extraordinary tenacity and cruelty, that routinely shot American prisoners, that used the bodies of dead Americans as traps with booby-wired grenades beneath them. The Pacific War was fought with a brutality on both sides that the European theater, for all its violence, rarely matched. In Europe, the understanding came more slowly for many American soldiers, particularly those who arrived in 1944. They were fighting Germany, which was an abstraction, a European nation that had started a war, until the moment American forces entered Germany itself and began discovering what the Nazi regime had actually been. The concentration camps and death camps encountered by American forces in the final months of the war, Buchenwald, Dachau, Mauthausen, and dozens of subcamps and satellite facilities, confronted soldiers with a reality so extreme that many found it impossible to process. General Eisenhower, when he visited Ohrdruf, a subcamp of Buchenwald, on April 12, 1945, ordered every available officer and soldier in the area to tour the camp so that no one could later say that what had happened there was a lie. He cabled Washington and London that the evidence of Nazi atrocities had to be documented and preserved because he anticipated that someday people would try to claim it had not occurred. He was right about that, too. The liberation of the concentration camps gave the European war a moral clarity that it had sometimes lacked in the grinding operational reality of hedgerow fighting and river crossings. The men who had come across the Atlantic to fight a war that many of them had not fully chosen, who had spent months in the mud and cold and fear of northwestern Europe, and who had watched their friends die in quantities that hollowed them out, those men now understood, with visceral and unmistakable certainty, what they had been fighting against. Some of them remembered it for the rest of their lives. Some of them couldn't talk about it. Some of them built their entire understanding of what the war had meant around what they saw in those camps. The liberation of Dachau on April 29, 1945, 9 days before Germany's final surrender, was for many of the soldiers who conducted it the most important moment of their war, more than any battle, more than any city liberated, more than any military victory. The technology of the war changed warfare permanently. The tank, which had existed as an imperfect instrument since 1916, was refined through the North Africa Campaign, the Eastern Front, the Norman hedgerows, and the Ardennes into something approaching its modern form, a combined arms weapon that worked with infantry and artillery and close air support rather than operating independently. The aircraft carrier, which had been viewed before Pearl Harbor as a supplement to battleship power, emerged from the Pacific Campaign as the undisputed capital ship of modern naval warfare. The battleship, which had dominated naval thinking for 50 years, was finished, reduced to providing shore bombardment in support of amphibious landings, a role for which it remained useful, and serving as floating command posts, a role for which it was ostentatiously useful, but never again fighting as the centerpiece of naval power. The atomic bomb changed everything else. The two weapons dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki did not simply end the Second World War. They ended the era of warfare in which total military victory through conventional means was a viable goal for a nuclear-armed nation. The bomb demonstrated that a weapon capable of destroying an entire city could be delivered by a single aircraft to any point on Earth. that the scale of destruction previously requiring armies and fleets could now be achieved by one plane and one crew. The implications were not immediately grasped by everyone who experienced August 1945. The American soldiers in Europe and the Pacific who heard the news of the atomic bombing understood it primarily as something that meant they would not have to invade Japan. That was real, immediate, personal, and enormously welcome. The long-term implications, the Cold War, the nuclear arms race, yes, the doctrine of mutually assured destruction that would govern international relations for the next 50 years, were not visible from the deck of the USS Missouri on September 2, 1945, but they were already present, embedded in the physics of the bomb, waiting to be expressed. What the men and women of the Second World War generation built in the years after September 2, 1945, with the lessons they had learned and the world they had purchased at such cost, is another story. The story of the post-war order, the Marshall Plan, NATO, the United Nations, the reconstruction of Germany and Japan as democratic nations that became stable members of the international community. That story is inseparable from the war that preceded it. You cannot understand why those institutions were built, or why they were built the way they were, without understanding what happened between 1941 and 1945 and what the generation that lived through it was determined never to see happen again. But that is another story. This one ends on the deck of the Missouri, on a clear September morning in Tokyo Bay, with General Douglas MacArthur standing before a microphone and a table with two documents on it. The flags of the Allied nations hung above him. The crew of the Missouri lined the decks above, representatives of the governments that had fought Japan for years, some of them since 1937, some since 1941, some since 1942, stood waiting. Mamoru Shigemitsu, his artificial leg making the short walk to the table and exercise in visible effort, signed for Japan. The pen moved across the document. It was done. MacArthur stepped to the microphone and said that it was his earnest hope, indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion a better world would emerge. He said that the issues involving divergent ideals and ideologies had been determined on the battlefields of the world, and that thenceforward all agreements, all treaties, must be kept. He said that the entire world was now at peace. Then he declared the proceedings closed. The Second World War was over. From the deck of the Missouri looking out over Tokyo Bay, you could see the Japanese coastline. You could see the city in the distance. You could see the ships of the Allied fleet spread across the water, hundreds of them, American and British and Australian, and the assembled naval power of the nations that had fought their way here across 3 years and 8 months and thousands of miles of ocean. And if you were one of the American sailors or soldiers or Marines standing on those decks or watching from those ships, if you had been at Pearl Harbor, or Guadalcanal, or North Africa, or Normandy, or the Bulge, or Iwo Jima, or Okinawa. If you had survived, which many had not, if you were here, which was not guaranteed on any of those days, then what you probably felt was not triumph, not pride exactly, not even relief, though relief was certainly part of it. What you probably felt was something quieter. The war was over. You were alive. The men beside you were alive. The men who were not beside you, who should have been. You carried them here too, you always would. It was over. That was what it meant. On September 2nd, 1945. It was over. The rest, what it meant, what it cost, what it purchased, what it changed, would take a lifetime to understand. Some people never finished understanding it. Some people understood it completely only at the moment of their own death, decades later, remembering the faces that had not been there when the ink dried on the deck of the Missouri, the faces that had made it possible, the faces of the men who had gone all the way and not come back. This is the story of what America did between December 7th, 1941, and September 2nd, 1945. It is a story about industrial power and military strategy and political leadership and operational brilliance. It is also, finally and essentially, a story about individual human beings. McClusky following a destroyer's wake, Waldron flying into the fire, shall the Marines on Bloody Ridge, the soldiers on Omaha Beach, the Screaming Eagles in Bastonia, the factory workers in Detroit, and Rosie the Riveter in her shipyard in California, who, when the moment came, did what was required. They did it without certainty of outcome. They did it knowing the cost. And they did it because the alternative, a world governed by the power of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, was something they had decided they would not accept. That decision cost 405,000 American lives. It cost tens of millions of lives around the world. And it produced the world that everyone listening to this was born into. A world that, for all its imperfections and ongoing struggles, is not the world that would have existed if the men who went to Midway and Guadalcanal and Kasserine Pass and Normandy and the Bulge and Iwo Jima and Okinawa had not done what they did. Remember them. That is the least we can do. It is also, in a way, the most important thing we can do, to remember them not as monuments or abstractions, but as people, with names and families and fears, and the extraordinary capacity for courage that ordinary human beings discover in themselves when the situation demands it. They were ordinary people. What they did was not ordinary at all. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe to this channel. Your support helps us bring more of these stories, the forgotten ones, the ones that deserve to be remembered, to more people. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Well, because if there's one thing this story makes clear, it's that these events belong to all of us, everywhere, regardless of where we were born or what flag we were born under. The world they built on September 2nd, 1945, is the world we all inherited. We owe it to the people who built it to understand what it cost. To fully understand what America faced in the Second World War, it helps to sit with the numbers that defined the enemy. By December 1941, the German Wehrmacht had been at war for over 2 years. It had conquered Poland in 27 days, Denmark in a day, Norway in 2 months, France, whose army had held Germany to a stalemate for 4 years in the First World War, in 6 weeks. By the end of 1941, Germany had driven the Soviet Union's armies back nearly to Moscow, yet had come within miles of capturing the Soviet capital and had inflicted casualties on the Soviet military that, had they fallen on any other nation, would almost certainly have produced a surrender. The Soviet Union did not surrender. But the scale of German military achievement between September 1939 and December 1941 was, in historical terms, something that had not been seen since Napoleon. Japan's military achievement in the same period was comparably staggering. The Japanese Imperial Army and Navy had been fighting in China since 1937, over 4 years of warfare before Pearl Harbor, and had conquered most of China's coastal cities and much of its productive interior. In the months between December 1941 and May 1942, Japanese forces seized more territory more quickly than any military force in the history of the modern world: the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, British Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, Burma, and Pacific Islands, stretching from the Aleutians to the edge of Australia. The total area seized was larger than the continental United States. Italy's military contributions to the Axis were less impressive, a fact recognized by all parties, including the Italians themselves. Italian forces had performed poorly in North Africa, and even more poorly in their attempted invasion of Greece in 1940, which had required German intervention to rescue. But Italy's geographical position, astride the Mediterranean, with bases in Sicily, Sardinia, and Libya, made it strategically significant regardless of the quality of its armed forces. Yet Italian resistance in North Africa, Tunisia, and Sicily was often fierce, even when the strategic situation was hopeless. Italian sailors and submarine crews fought with courage throughout the Mediterranean campaign. The Italian collapse in 1943 was as much a political failure of the fascist system as a military one. Against this combination of enemies, The United States had to fight simultaneously in the Pacific and the Atlantic and the Mediterranean and eventually northwestern Europe. The logistics of simultaneously supporting campaigns in environments as different as the Central Pacific atolls, the North African desert, the Italian mountains, the Norman hedgerows, and the Philippine jungle placed demands on American planning and supply systems that would have been considered fantastical in 1939. By 1944, American supply lines extended from factories in Michigan and Ohio and California, through ports on both coasts, across oceans to forward bases in Hawaii and Britain and North Africa and Australia, to front lines that were moving forward, sometimes slowly, sometimes with dramatic speed, in multiple theaters simultaneously. The commanders who managed this complexity were, by the end of the war, a generation of military professionals who had no real precedent. Eisenhower had never commanded so much as a battalion in combat before the war. He had spent his career in staff positions and instructional assignments, writing plans, studying military history, learning the theory of operations. When he took command of the Allied Expeditionary Force in January 1944, he was commanding the largest military coalition in history: American, British, Canadian, Free French, Polish, and other forces, in the preparation and execution of the most complex amphibious operation ever attempted. He was not the most aggressive tactician among his contemporaries. He was something more important: a coalition manager of exceptional skill, a man who could hold together the conflicting egos and national interests and strategic priorities of multiple powerful nations, and keep the collective effort pointed at the correct objective. Nimitz was a different kind of commander, quieter, more reserved, more analytical than Eisenhower, but equally effective in the coalitional role. He managed the enormous personality of Douglas MacArthur, who commanded the Southwest Pacific Area Theater, while Nimitz commanded the Central Pacific, with the deft combination of deference, firmness, and strategic clarity that the situation required. MacArthur himself was a figure of such complexity and contradiction. Genuine military brilliance combined with narcissism of truly extraordinary proportions. Personal bravery combined with a willingness to court-martial subordinates for his own failures. A vision of the Pacific campaign that was broadly correct, combined with a sensitivity to any perceived slight that consumed enormous amounts of energy. That managing him was itself a full-time strategic challenge. Patton and Bradley were, in many ways, the opposite ends of the American ground command spectrum. Bradley was methodical, careful, respected by his men for his genuine concern for their welfare, sometimes criticized for excessive caution. Patton was instinctive, aggressive, brilliant in the exploitation phase of operations, deeply flawed in ways that nearly ended his career twice. Once, when he slapped 2 hospitalized soldiers in Sicily whom he accused of cowardice, and once when his public political remarks alarmed the Allied High Command, and absolutely irreplaceable as the commander of an armored exploitation force given a breakthrough and open ground. The two men complemented each other in ways that neither would have fully acknowledged. The junior commanders, the colonels, lieutenant colonels, and majors who commanded the regiments and battalions that did the actual fighting, were, by 1944, products of 2 to 3 years of intense combat experience. They had survived North Africa, Sicily, the Pacific Islands, and the early phases of the Normandy campaign. They had learned things about tactical warfare that could not be taught in any classroom. They had learned which doctrinal principles applied in which circumstances and which had to be discarded the moment they met contact. They had learned how to keep men moving forward under fire, how to coordinate with adjacent units and supporting arms in conditions where communication was unreliable, how to make decisions under time pressure with incomplete information and act on those decisions with confidence, even knowing that the decision might be wrong. The American Army of 1944 and 1945 was a fundamentally different institution than the one that had stumbled into Kasserine Pass in February 1943. The difference was combat experience, and combat experience was purchased in blood. And the soldiers themselves, the privates and corporals and sergeants who formed the actual substance of the combat force, came from every part of American society. The Army draft was, in theory, a great democratizer. It took men regardless of class, education, regional origin, or occupation, and mixed them together in units that might include a steelworker from Pittsburgh, alongside a college student from Vermont, alongside a farmer from Georgia, alongside a shopkeeper from Los Angeles. In practice, the mixing was not complete. Black Americans served in segregated units, and class and education still determined who went to officer candidate school and who remained in the enlisted ranks. But the degree of social mixing was real and historically significant. That men who would never have spoken to each other in peacetime learned to depend on each other in combat in ways that formed bonds that lasted lifetimes. The soldiers who came home, roughly 15 million Americans who served and survived, carried the war with them in ways that shaped American society for decades. The GI Bill, passed in 1944, provided veterans with education benefits, housing loans, and job training that sent a generation of working-class men to college and allowed them to buy homes in the suburbs that were being built across America in the late 1940s and 1950s. The economic and social transformation of post-war America, the great middle-class expansion, the growth of higher education, the suburbanization of American life, was partly an expression of what the GI Bill did with the veterans of World War II. Yet the veterans themselves tended to get to work rather than talking about what they had seen. They built families, built careers, built communities. Many of them did not speak about the war to their children or grandchildren, sometimes for decades. Some of them never spoke about it at all. The silence had multiple meanings. Some of it was the simple reticence of men who had seen things that did not translate well into civilian conversation, who had no language available to convey what combat had actually been like to people who had not experienced it, and who were not sure they wanted to try. Some of it was the deliberate suppression of memories that were too painful or too disturbing to surface. Yet some of it was the practical, forward-looking energy of people who had survived something terrible and were now focused on building the life they had fought for. The psychiatrists who studied World War II veterans in the decades after the war found rates of what would now be diagnosed as post-traumatic stress disorder that were significant, but also found that the social context of the post-war period, which honored veterans and provided them with economic opportunity, appears to have mitigated the worst long-term effects in many cases. The men who came home were not broken, as a class, though many individuals were. They were, in a general sense, eager to live. The women who had worked in the factories and shipyards during the war years faced a different kind of transition. Many were asked, or expected, or required, to give their factory jobs back to returning veterans and return to domestic roles that the war had temporarily suspended. Many did so willingly, many did not. The experience of economic independence, of technical skill, of working alongside other women and men in complex organizations toward shared goals, that experience was not easily surrendered, and the women who had it carried it forward into a post-war world that was not always sure what to do with them. The changes in women's economic participation and social expectations that accelerated in the 1950s and 1960s are partly rooted in what happened in American factories and shipyards between 1942 and 1945. The war did not complete a social revolution, but it planted seeds that grew for generations. The enemies America had defeated were, in the years after 1945, transformed. Germany, divided and occupied by the Allied powers, was rebuilt under the Marshall Plan and eventually reunified as a democratic nation that became one of the most stable and prosperous in the world. Japan, occupied by American forces under MacArthur's administration, was given a new constitution that renounced war as a sovereign right and established democratic institutions that have remained stable for 8 decades. Both transformations were remarkable, perhaps the most remarkable achievements in the history of post-war reconstruction. They were not inevitable. They required sustained investment, political will, and the recognition, by the nations that had defeated Germany and Japan, that the long-term interest lay in building stable democratic allies rather than punitive occupation. As the contrast with the aftermath of World War I, the vindictive Peace of Versailles, the economic punishment of Germany, the conditions that produced the political crisis of the 1920s and 1930s that made Hitler possible, was not coincidental. The men who designed the post-war order had studied what went wrong after 1918 and were determined not to repeat it. Eisenhower, who as Supreme Commander had presided over the liberation of Western Europe, became the Supreme Commander of the new North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the collective defense alliance that would anchor Western security for the rest of the 20th century. The alliance was built on the understanding, learned at enormous cost between 1941 and 1945, that collective security was the only form of security worth having, that no single nation, however powerful, it could defend itself and its interests without allies, and that allies were worth maintaining in peacetime rather than building from scratch in the emergency of war. The lesson was simple. The willingness to apply it consistently across decades and changing political circumstances was the test of whether the generation that had fought the war had truly understood what it cost. The Cold War that followed the Second World War was, in many ways, shaped by the war itself, by the exhaustion of the European powers, by the emergence of the United States and the Soviet Union as the only two nations with both the industrial base and the military capacity to project global power, and by the presence of nuclear weapons that made direct conflict between those two powers existentially dangerous. The 44 years of the Cold War, from 1947 to 1991, were in a real sense a consequence of the 6 years of the Second World War. The world that emerged from September 2, 1945, was a world in which the old European order was gone, in which two superpowers faced each other across an ideological divide, and in which the technology that had ended the Second World War had made a Third World War unthinkable, or at least required to be unthinkable, on pain of civilizational destruction. The men and women who fought the Second World War did not choose any of this. They did not choose to live in a world where their country was attacked on December 7, 1941. They did not choose to be the generation that had to fight the most destructive war in human history. They chose, many of them after Pearl Harbor, as some of them before, to respond to the world as it was rather than as they wished it had been. They chose to serve, to fight, to produce, to sacrifice. And then, when it was over, they chose, most of them, to build rather than mourn, to create rather than be consumed by what they had survived. That combination of endurance and forward motion, of capacity for sacrifice and capacity for recovery, is perhaps the deepest truth the Second World War reveals about the people who fought it. They were not superhuman. They were afraid and uncertain, and often exhausted, and sometimes broken. What they were was committed to each other, to the mission, to the larger purpose that gave the mission meaning. McClusky pressing on past the point of calculation, Waldron flying into the fire, the soldier at Omaha Beach keeping his feet moving, and McAuliffe saying nuts. All of them, in their different ways, at their different moments, choosing to do what needed to be done because someone had to do it, and they were there. The world they saved is the world we live in. The freedom they defended is the freedom we exercise. The peace they purchased, imperfect, contested, repeatedly tested, but still fundamentally intact 8 decades later, is the peace we sometimes take for granted. We should not take it for granted. We should understand what it cost. We should remember who paid for it. And we should try, in whatever circumstances our own lives present to us, to be worthy of what they did. That is the story of how America fought Germany, Japan, and Italy in the Second World War. It is a story of industrial power and strategic vision and operational brilliance. Yeah, it is a story of leadership and coalition building and intelligence and technology and logistics. And it is, most fundamentally, a story about people, about what ordinary people are capable of when the circumstances demand something extraordinary from them, and when they decide, against every reasonable calculation of personal safety and comfort, to give it. From December 7th, 1941, to September 2nd, 1945. From the smoke over Battleship Row at Pearl Harbor to the signatures on a deck table in Tokyo Bay. From the ocean beneath McClusky's wings to the frozen foxholes at Bastogne, to the beaches of Normandy, to the streets of liberated Paris, to the ruins of Berlin, to the deck of the Missouri. The distance is measured in miles and years and battles and names, yet the meaning is measured in something that resists precise calculation. In the lives lived and the lives ended, in the world that was prevented and the world that was built, in the cost and the achievement of what the generation of 1941 to 1945 did when the darkness came. They held, they advanced, they won. And we are here, in the world they made, because they did. Thank you for watching. If this story meant something to you, please subscribe to this channel and leave a comment. Share this video with someone who might not know this story as well as they should. These men and women deserve to be remembered by more than those of us who already know their names. Help us make sure they are. There is a specific kind of silence that hangs over a battlefield after the fighting ends. Soldiers who have experienced it describe it the same way across different wars and different centuries, an absence of sound that feels heavier than noise, a stillness that the ear keeps expecting to be broken by the next volley or the next engine or the next explosion that does not come. The veterans of the Second World War knew that silence in many forms. On Guadalcanal after the last Japanese patrol was destroyed, in the Ardennes after the German offensive was broken, on German soil after the last resistance collapsed, in Tokyo Bay on the morning of September 2nd, 1945. It was, each time, the silence of something finished, of something survived. To understand the Second World War as Americans fought it, you need to understand something that is easy to lose in the grand strategic sweep of the narrative. Most of the men who fought it did not experience it as a grand narrative. They experienced it as a sequence of days, specific, concrete, physical days, in which they were cold or hot or wet or hungry or terrified or bored, in which the man beside them was alive and then was not, in which they moved forward or dug in or retreated, in which they did what their training and their orders and their instincts told them to do, and hoped that the sum of all those actions by all those men in all those places was adding up to something. They were right that it was adding up to something. Most of them never knew from inside the experience what that something was. The commanders knew more because they had access to the operational picture. But even the commanders, even Eisenhower with his intelligence summaries and his staff briefings and his maps, were making decisions in a fog that intelligence never fully lifted. The planning for Overlord was as thorough as human ingenuity could make it, and the planning was useless from the moment the first landing craft touched the sand at Omaha Beach, because war does not respect plans, and the only thing that mattered from that moment was whether individual soldiers kept moving. They kept moving. The story of the Second World War is, at every level, a story about that choice, the choice to keep moving. It is the choice McClusky made over the empty Pacific, pressing on past the rational calculation of fuel and probability. It is the choice Waldron made when he pointed his torpedo bombers at the Japanese combat air patrol, yet knowing what it meant. It is the choice the Marines made on Bloody Ridge at Guadalcanal, and the choice the soldiers made on Omaha Beach, and the choice the paratroopers made in Bastogne, and the choice the dive bomber pilots made when they pulled their aircraft over into the long, screaming descent toward the Japanese carriers that Sunday morning in June 1942, knowing that anti-aircraft fire was reaching up for them and that some of them would not pull out of that dive. It is also the choice made by the people who were not on those beaches, or those ships, or those islands. The choice made by the women in the factories, the scientists in the laboratories, the planners in the war rooms, the farmers who planted more crops to feed armies across the world, the merchants who rationed their own goods, yes, the families who planted victory gardens and bought war bonds and sent their sons and brothers and husbands and fathers to places whose names they had to look up on maps. The war was not won by the fighting men alone. It was won by the entire society that produced and supplied and maintained them, and that sustained the will to continue when the cost became visible and the outcome remained uncertain. Between Pearl Harbor in December 1941 and the Missouri in September 1945, the United States of America, a nation that had been trying very hard not to fight this war, that had watched Europe collapse with a combination of horror and relief, that had convinced itself that the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans were sufficient protection from the conflicts of the Old World, found out what it was made of. The answer was not simple. Oh, the answer included racism and injustice, and the internment of Japanese Americans, and the segregation of black soldiers, and the exploitation of workers, and the corruption that accompanies any mobilization on that scale. These are part of the history too, and they matter. They do not cancel what was also true, that the same nation that imprisoned its own citizens of Japanese descent produced the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, whose Nisei soldiers fought with a fury and distinction that was, among other things, a statement about what it meant to be American. That the same country that segregated its armed forces produced the Tuskegee Airmen, whose combat record was a refutation of every argument for segregation. That the same society that told women to go home after the war was over had been, for 4 years, entirely dependent on those women's labor to keep the production lines running. The contradictions are the history. The history is not a simple story of virtue triumphing over evil, though there was virtue and there was evil, and the distinction between them was real. It is a more complicated story about a nation finding, in the extremity of total war, resources of courage and determination and adaptability and generosity, toward allies, toward enemies after the fighting ended, toward the idea of a better world order that surprised everyone, including the Americans themselves. The Pacific War had a particular character that set it apart from the European theater. The distances were vast. The Pacific Ocean covers more than 60 million square miles, nearly a third of the Earth's surface, and the island chains on which the campaign was fought were scattered across that immensity at distances that made every operation a logistical challenge before it was a military one. The terrain on the islands themselves, the coral atolls, the volcanic mountains, the triple canopy jungle, the malarial lowlands, was hostile to human life in ways that northwestern European farmland, however dangerous, was not. Men on Guadalcanal and Peleliu and Iwo Jima and Okinawa were fighting the environment as well as the enemy. The heat, the disease, the insects, the water that was never clean, the rations that were never adequate, the gear that rotted, and the weapons that jammed from humidity. All of this was the context in which the tactical decisions had to be made and executed. As the Japanese enemy was also specifically different from the German enemy in ways that affected how the war was fought. German soldiers surrendered when the tactical situation was hopeless, not always, not without resistance, but regularly enough that prisoner-of-war facilities on the Western Front were full of German soldiers throughout 1944 and 1945. Japanese soldiers rarely surrendered. Japanese military doctrine considered surrender to be a disgrace that dishonored both the individual soldier and his family. The result was that every Japanese defensive position had to be taken by direct assault, because the defenders would not yield. The casualty ratios in Pacific Island assaults reflected this reality. At Tarawa, where a Marine division assaulted a heavily fortified atoll of less than a square mile in area, 4,690 Japanese defenders were killed and only 17 were taken prisoner. The rest died in the assault or afterward. This was the pattern across the Pacific campaign, from the first landings in the Solomons to the last battles on Okinawa. The American response to this tactical reality evolved over time. The Navy and Marine Corps developed and refined amphibious doctrine, the techniques for conducting opposed landings against fortified beaches, into a science that did not exist before the war. Naval gunfire support became progressively more accurate and more sustained. The timing of the bombardment relative to the landing improved. The techniques for clearing beach obstacles improved. The close coordination between aircraft and ground forces improved. The early amphibious operations, like Guadalcanal and Tarawa, were accomplished despite significant organizational and technical deficiencies. The later operations, like Iwo Jima and Okinawa, were conducted with a level of joint coordination that had no precedent in the history of amphibious warfare. The cost was still high. But the operational execution had become, by 1945, very nearly as good as it was possible for it to be. The Army's adaptation in the European theater followed a parallel course. The organizational and leadership failures of Kasserine Pass produced changes that made the Army more effective at El Gueter, and more effective again at Anzio, and more effective again in Normandy, and more effective again in the Bulge and across the Rhine. The institutional capacity to learn from failure, to make changes, to apply the lessons quickly, guide across an organization of millions of men spread across multiple theaters, was one of the defining characteristics of the American military in the Second World War. It was not always fast enough. The learning often came at painful cost. But the direction of movement was consistently toward greater effectiveness, and the rate of improvement was, measured against any historical standard, extraordinary. The American industrial capacity that supported this military improvement was, in the end, the decisive factor in the war. Yamamoto had been right about that. The German planners who estimated American industrial production had been right about that too. They just couldn't believe their own numbers. The idea that a democracy, a society organized around consumer choice and individual interest and political competition, it could mobilize its industrial base as completely and efficiently as a totalitarian state. The Germans and Japanese genuinely did not believe it was possible. They were wrong. The mobilization of American industry after Pearl Harbor was, in terms of its speed and completeness and efficiency, one of the great organizational achievements in the history of human civilization. It produced the weapons and the supplies and the equipment that put American soldiers on every battlefield in the world and kept them there, fed and armed and fighting until the enemy had nothing left. The men who flew the dive bombers at Midway flew aircraft built in American factories. The Marines who stormed Guadalcanal carried rifles manufactured in American arsenals and ate rations packed in American canneries. The soldiers who crossed Omaha Beach under German fire were supplied by a logistics network that stretched back to American farms and factories and ports. The paratroopers at Bastogne were resupplied by American-built transport aircraft flown by American crews. The atomic bombs that ended the Pacific War were the product of the Manhattan Project, the most complex and expensive scientific industrial undertaking in the history of the United States. A project that employed over 130,000 people at facilities spread across the country, that spent approximately $2 billion in 1945, that brought together the finest scientists in the world from a dozen nations, that maintained its secrecy for years against the determined efforts of Soviet intelligence, and that produced, in the Trinity test at Alamogordo, New Mexico, on July 16, 1945, the first explosion of an atomic weapon in human history. J. Robert Oppenheimer, the scientific director of the Manhattan Project, stood in a bunker at the Trinity test site and watched the world change. He later said that the words that came into his mind were from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." It was an accurate description of what had just been created. Whether it was also an accurate prediction of what would follow depended on choices that had not yet been made. Choices about how nuclear weapons would be used, whether they would spread to other nations, whether the nations that possessed them would find ways to manage their relationship so that those weapons were never used in war again. Those choices are still being made, 80 years later. Yet they are being made by people living in the world that was produced by the Second World War. That world, our world, is the inheritance of the generation that fought from 1941 to 1945. It is an inheritance that includes the United Nations and NATO and the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund and the global trading system, and the concept of universal human rights codified in the Universal Declaration of 1948, all of them products of the post-war order built by the people who had survived the war and were determined to build something better than what had preceded it. It is also an inheritance that includes nuclear weapons, and the Cold War, and the Korean War, and the Vietnam War, and all the other conflicts that the post-war world has not managed to prevent. See, the Second World War ended war as a tool of great power competition among the major industrial nations. It did not end war. It changed what war was and where it happened. The men and women of the Second World War generation are nearly all gone now. The veterans who are still alive are in their 90s and beyond. Each year the number diminishes. Within a decade, within 2, there will be no living memory of what it was like to be on a carrier at Midway, or in a foxhole at Bastogne, or on the beach at Normandy. The war will belong entirely to history, to the documents and the photographs and the recorded testimonies and the accounts written by people who were there, and the accounts written by historians who studied the accounts of people who were there. Yet what we do with that history, whether we engage with it seriously enough to understand it, whether we draw from it the lessons it contains about what human beings are capable of, both in violence and in courage, whether we honor the people who lived it by making the effort to know their stories, is a choice that every generation has to make for itself. The history will not demand anything of us. It will simply be there, available, waiting to be engaged with or ignored. This account is an argument for engagement, for taking the time to understand not just that the Second World War happened and that America fought in it and that the Allies won, but why and how and at what cost and through what combination of heroism and suffering and organizational skill and industrial power and political will and plain human stubbornness, but for understanding that the world we live in, the world of liberal democracy and international institutions, and the general peace among great powers that has held, however imperfectly, for 8 decades, was purchased at a price by people whose names we can learn if we choose to, whose stories we can know if we make the effort. They made the effort. They made an effort that dwarfs anything that knowledge of their stories requires of us. McClusky flew past the point of prudent calculation over the Pacific. Waldron flew into the fire. The Marines held Bloody Ridge. The soldiers crossed Omaha Beach. The paratroopers held Bastogne. They did not do these things so that we would remember them. They did them because the moment required it, and because they were the people who were there when the moment came. But remembering them is the right response to what they did. It is the minimum we owe. From Pearl Harbor to the Missouri, from December 7th, 1941 to September 2nd, 1945. 3 years, 8 months, 25 days in the Pacific. 2.5 years in Europe and North Africa. 16 million Americans under arms. 405,000 dead. The world changed. The darkness was beaten back. And the people who beat it back were, in the end, ordinary people. The same kind of people who are alive in every generation, in every country, who, when the moment came, discovered in themselves what the moment required. That is the story. That is what it means. That is what we should know and not forget. There is a building in Washington, D.C. that sits between the Lincoln Memorial and the Washington Monument on the National Mall. Where every American president and every visiting foreign dignitary eventually comes to stand. It is the National World War II Memorial, dedicated in 2004, almost 60 years after the war it commemorates. It is built in a style that some have called triumphal and others have found fitting. A large oval plaza with 2 pavilions, one for the Atlantic Theater and one for the Pacific Theater, ringed by pillars representing the states and territories of the United States, with a wall of gold stars at the western end, 1 star for every 100 Americans killed in the war. There are 4,048 gold stars on that wall. They represent 404,800 dead. Visitors who come to the memorial on a summer day find it full of people, tourists from across America and around the world, school groups learning about a war that ended before their grandparents were born, veterans in their 90s in wheelchairs pushed by their grandchildren, foreign visitors who understand, often with a specificity that some Americans lack, exactly what the memorial commemorates. The veterans who come there in their wheelchairs, fewer each year because time is inexorable, sometimes stop and sit in silence for a while. They are not reading the inscriptions. They do not need to read the inscriptions. They are remembering things that no inscription can contain. The memorial is a formal, public representation of something that the veterans themselves often experienced as profoundly private and not particularly formal. The war they fought was not a monument, and it was mud and blood and fear and boredom and sudden violence and the faces of the men beside them and the sound of artillery and the smell of things that should not be smelled and the specific weight of a rifle carried for months until it became an extension of the arm. The monument captures none of this. No monument can capture any of this. What monuments can do is mark the fact that it happened, is say to the people who walk past that this was real, that people lived and died in the service of something larger than themselves, and that they deserve to be remembered. The veterans of the Second World War are, as a group, notably reluctant to be called heroes. Ask one of them, and the response is often a deflection. I just did my job. Or, the real heroes didn't come home. These responses are not false modesty, yet they reflect something genuine about the experience of combat. The sense that survival was partly a matter of chance, that the men who died were no less brave or capable than the men who lived, and that the difference between a hero and a casualty was often a matter of where you were standing when the mortar round came in. The veterans who say the real heroes didn't come home are not being self-deprecating. They are describing, accurately, how combat worked. That the men they served with were no more afraid and no less skilled than they were, and that some of those men are names on a wall in Washington, and some of them are old men in wheelchairs. And the difference is not moral or military. The difference is luck. This understanding, that survival is not a mark of superior worth, yet that the dead are not less than the living, shapes how the best veterans of the Second World War have carried their experience. They tend to be careful about claiming too much for themselves. They tend to be generous in their attribution of courage and sacrifice to those who did not survive. And they tend, almost universally, to say that the war was the defining experience of their lives, not because it was glorious, which it was not, and not because it was ennobling, which it only sometimes was, but because it was the moment when they discovered what they were made of, when the ordinary routines of civilian life were stripped away, and what was left was the essential question of whether they could do what was required of them. Most of them found that they could. That discovery, made at enormous cost, and in conditions of extreme hardship and danger, became the foundation of everything that followed for them. The generation that fought the Second World War and then came home and built the post-war world, the generation that is now called the Greatest Generation, a label that many of its members find excessive, was not remarkable for the qualities they were born with. The evidence does not support the idea that the people born between 1910 and 1925 were somehow inherently more courageous or more selfless or more capable than the generations that preceded or followed them. What the evidence does support is that they were tested in a specific way, by specific circumstances, at a specific moment in history, and that the testing revealed qualities in them that the circumstances demanded. And other generations have been tested differently and have responded to different challenges. The question is not whether this generation was uniquely great, but whether the specific challenge it faced, total war on a global scale against enemies of genuine evil, produced a response that was, measured against the requirements of that challenge, sufficient. It was sufficient. The world we live in is the evidence. What the study of the Second World War offers, beyond the specific historical knowledge it conveys, is a kind of moral education in what human beings are capable of, in both directions. The war contains the Holocaust, the Nanking Massacre, the death camps, the deliberate starvation of prisoners, the bombing of civilian populations, the systematic use of terror as an instrument of military and political policy. Was it contains the worst of what human beings do to each other when ideology and power and dehumanization of the enemy create the conditions in which atrocity becomes possible. It also contains Midway and Guadalcanal and Omaha Beach and Bastogne and the liberation of the concentration camps and the Marshall Plan and the rebuilding of Germany and Japan as democratic nations. It contains the best of what human beings are capable of when the situation demands courage, sacrifice, organizational brilliance, and the will to build something better than what existed before. Both things are true, and neither cancels the other. The war was both catastrophic and necessary. The victory was both costly and justified. The peace that followed was both imperfect and better than what preceded it. Yet the generation that fought the war was both ordinary and capable of extraordinary things. These are not contradictions to be resolved. They are the texture of reality, of human history as it actually was, rather than as we might wish it had been. The specific battles this account has described, Midway, Guadalcanal, the North Africa campaign, the Sicily and Italy campaigns, D-Day and the liberation of France, the Battle of the Bulge, the crossing of the Rhine, and in the Pacific the Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, were not the entire war. The entire war included the convoy battles in the Atlantic, the air campaign against Germany, the fighting in the China-Burma-India theater, the special operations forces operating behind enemy lines in France and Norway and Yugoslavia and across Southeast Asia, the submarine campaign in the Pacific that strangled Japan's maritime supply lines and is one of the most effective campaigns of its kind in the history of naval warfare. The massive logistical effort that kept the fighting forces supplied across 2 oceans and multiple continents, and thousands of other operations and engagements, too numerous to describe in any single account. The submarine campaign in the Pacific deserves particular mention. American submarines operating from Pearl Harbor and later from Brisbane and Fremantle in Australia conducted a campaign against Japanese shipping that was, in terms of its strategic effect relative to the resources committed, one of the most cost-effective operations of the entire war. Japanese merchant shipping, the tankers and cargo vessels that carried oil from the Dutch East Indies, the ore and raw materials from the occupied territories, food and equipment between the home islands and the far-flung garrisons of the Pacific Empire, was the lifeline of the Japanese war economy. The submarine campaign systematically destroyed that lifeline. By 1944, American submarines were sinking Japanese merchant ships faster than they could be replaced. Japan's industrial capacity was declining not because its factories were being bombed. The strategic bombing campaign against Japan did not become truly effective until the B-29s began operating from the Marianas in late 1944, but because the raw materials those factories needed were no longer arriving. By the time of Japan's surrender in August 1945, Japanese industry had been brought to near paralysis, not primarily by bombing, but by strangulation, by the destruction of the maritime supply lines on which the entire economic structure of the Japanese war effort depended. The price the American submarine force paid for this achievement was the highest casualty rate of any branch of the American armed forces in the Second World War. Approximately 3,500 American submariners were killed, representing roughly 22% of those who served in submarines, 1 in 5. The submarines that went out on patrol and did not come back, 52 boats in total, went down in waters so deep that their final moments were never reconstructed, their crews' fates never precisely known. They are listed as lost at sea, which is both accurate and, in its brevity, add a profound understatement of what it meant to die in a flooded submarine compartment hundreds of feet below the surface of the Pacific Ocean. The air campaign in Europe extracted a comparable toll. The 8th Air Force, based in England, lost over 26,000 men killed in action between its first combat missions in 1942 and the end of the war in May 1945. Over 6,000 aircraft were lost. The life expectancy of a bomber crew in the 8th Air Force in the worst period of 1943 was, by statistical calculation, less than the 25 missions required for a crew to complete a tour of duty. Men flew knowing these odds. Some of them maintained the fiction that the odds would not apply to them, a psychological defense that combat veterans call the illusion of invulnerability, and that is probably adaptive. Others were more clear-eyed. They flew anyway because the mission required it, and because the men they flew with needed them to be there, and because, even if they could not articulate it in these terms, they understood that what they were doing mattered. What they were doing mattered. The air campaign over Germany, for all its terrible cost and its limitations, destroyed Germany's synthetic fuel production, cratered the transportation network, disrupted war production, and forced Germany to divert a massive proportion of its entire military effort to air defense. By 1944, roughly 60% of the German heavy anti-aircraft artillery, the 88mm guns that were also the most effective anti-tank weapons in the German arsenal, was deployed against the Allied air offensive rather than against Soviet and Allied ground forces. Now, the argument that the strategic air campaign was not cost-effective, which has been made by serious historians, is complicated by what those 88mm guns would have done if they had been available on the Eastern Front or in Normandy rather than pointed at the sky over the Ruhr. The Eastern Front, which this account has only touched on in passing, was the central theater of the European war in terms of scale and duration. The Soviet Union absorbed approximately 27 million military and civilian dead between 1941 and 1945. The battles on the Eastern Front, from Barbarossa in June 1941 to the fall of Berlin in May 1945, involved forces and casualties that dwarfed anything in the Western theaters. Germany committed the overwhelming majority of its ground forces to the Eastern Front throughout the war. Yet the Soviet victory in the East, at Stalingrad, at Kursk, at the Vistula-Oder offensive, and ultimately at Berlin, was decisive to the outcome of the war in Europe in a way that cannot be understated. The Allied contribution, American, British, Canadian, and the contributions of the other Allied nations, was not the primary cause of Germany's defeat. The primary cause of Germany's defeat was the Soviet army and the Soviet people, who absorbed the worst the German military could deliver and kept fighting. What the Western Allies contributed was the pressure on the Second Front that Germany had to divide its forces to meet, the supply of enormous quantities of equipment and food to the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease that sustained Soviet fighting power through the worst years, and the destruction of German industrial and transportation infrastructure through the air campaign, and ultimately the liberation of Western Europe and the closing of the western jaw of the vice. The Germany that surrendered on May 8, 1945, was crushed between the Soviet army from the east and the Allied armies from the west. Neither side could have achieved what it achieved without the other. This is the full shape of the Second World War, as America fought it. The Pacific Theater from Pearl Harbor to the Missouri, the Atlantic Lifeline, the North Africa Campaign, the Mediterranean campaigns, the liberation of Western Europe, and the Strategic Air Campaign and Submarine Campaign running throughout. It is a story of enormous complexity and scope, fought across the entire globe, sustained over 4 years, each costing hundreds of thousands of American lives and tens of millions of lives in total. It is also, finally, a story about what human beings can do, what they can withstand, what they can build, what they can sacrifice, and what they can achieve, when the circumstances demand the best from them, and they find a way to give it. The sun rose over Tokyo Bay on the morning of September 2, 1945, as it had risen over Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. The difference between those two mornings was the work of the 1,365 days in between. The battles and the campaigns and the production and the sacrifice and the courage and the decisions and the strategies and the individual moments of choice multiplied millions of times across thousands of miles and 4 years of war. That produced a world in which the sun rose over the deck of the USS Missouri while the representatives of the Japanese Empire signed the document of their nation's unconditional surrender. The signing took 23 minutes. The Second World War had been going on, in one form or another, since Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931. 14 years. For America, it had been 3 years, 8 months, and 25 days from Pearl Harbor to the Missouri. The 23 minutes of the surrender ceremony were, in some ways, the most important 23 minutes of the 20th century. They marked the end of the era in which the great military empires of the industrial age, Germany, Japan, and Italy, had pursued domination by force. They marked the beginning of the era in which American power, exercised with the lessons of the war in mind, would attempt to build a different kind of international order. The attempt was imperfect and is ongoing. The alternative, the world that would have existed if the men who flew to Midway and crossed Omaha Beach and held Bastogne had not done what they did, is something that exists only in the imagination. And the imagination, confronted with what we know of what the Nazi regime and the Japanese Empire had done and intended to do, does not linger there willingly. They stopped it. That is the essential fact. They stopped it at enormous cost, and what they built in its place, however imperfect, however contested, however threatened in every subsequent generation, is the world we live in. Remember them, know their stories, carry forward what they purchased. That is what we owe.